In the spring of 1856, as lightning split the sky above the small village of Smiljan, in the region then known as the Austrian Empire, a child was born into a world of thunder and electricity. His mother, Juka Mandic, a woman of remarkable ingenuity and restless mind, felt the storm as an omen, perhaps even a promise, that the boy arriving during this celestial violence would himself become a force of nature, a man who would one day command the very lightning that announced his entrance into the world. His father, Nikola Tesla, was a Serbian Orthodox priest, a man of words and contemplation, of liturgy and philosophy, and in the candlelit rooms of the parsonage, young Nikola would grow up surrounded by the cadences of sacred language, by the rhythm of prayer, by the deep wells of imagination that only silence and isolation can create. The village itself was remote, nestled in the limestone hills of the Balkans, where the landscape rolled in shades of grey and green, where villages were separated by vast stretches of forest and stone, where winter came long and harsh, and spring arrived like a miracle. It was a place where the modern world had not yet penetrated, where horse carts moved slowly along dirt roads, where candles and oil lamps were the only sources of light after darkness fell, where the rhythms of life had not changed for centuries, and yet in this ancient, isolated place, one of the greatest minds of the coming age was being born. Nikola Tesla was not an ordinary woman. In an era when the domestic sphere was considered the only proper domain for females of any station, she occupied herself not with needlework or gossip, but with invention. She created household devices of remarkable practicality, improvements to cooking implements, designs for tools that made domestic work more efficient. She had a mechanical mind, a restless intelligence that could perceive problems and envision solutions. She understood how things worked. There was something in her, an unflinching rationality combined with imaginative power, that would pass to her son like a precious inheritance. His father, by contrast, was a man of the spirit, a man whose mind moved through the realm of ideas and faith, whose evenings were spent in study and contemplation. The two parents represented two different modes of being, the practical and the theoretical, the mechanical and the mystical, and in their son, these two currents would flow together and create something unprecedented. Young Nikola was a sensitive child, prone to vivid and overwhelming visions. Even as a small boy, he experienced the world with an intensity that most people never know. When he closed his eyes, he could see things with perfect clarity, not imaginary things exactly, but remembered things, things he had observed, rendered with such perfect fidelity that they were nearly more real than the originals. He had an eidetic memory, a mind that photographed the world and stored those images with complete precision. He could walk through a room once and remember every detail, the position of every object, the exact colour of the walls, the way the light fell through the windows. This gift, which might seem like an unambiguous blessing, was in fact a kind of torment. The images would come unbidden. He could not control them. A fear he had experienced years before could suddenly replay itself in his mind with such vividness that his heart would race and his palms would sweat as if he were living the moment anew. His sensitivity extended to sounds, to smells, to the smallest variations in light and temperature. The world was not a comfortable place for a child so exquisitely attuned to every stimulus. When Nikola was 9 years old, his older brother Dane died. The circumstances are not entirely clear. Different accounts suggest different causes, but the impact was absolute and irreversible. Dane was talented, accomplished, the son who seemed destined for the greatest things. His death was a rupture in the family, a wound that never quite healed. For young Nikola, already prone to vivid and intrusive visions, the loss became a permanent feature of his internal landscape. He began to suffer episodes of illness and depression that seemed to have no physical cause, what we might now call anxiety or trauma, but which in the 19th century was simply experienced as a mysterious, overwhelming malady. His parents, desperate to save their remaining son, sent him to the countryside, hoping that fresh air and time away from the sight of his grief would restore him. It was during these years, moving between relatives' homes, staying in villages and small towns across the Balkans, that Nikola developed an almost mystical connection to the landscape, to storms, to electricity, to the raw power of nature. He would walk alone for hours, contemplating, observing, feeling himself part of something vast and unknowable. He was a brilliant student. Whatever difficulties he experienced emotionally, intellectually, he moved with ease. In the gymnasium at Graz, he distinguished himself immediately, absorbing mathematics and physics with an almost intuitive understanding. His teachers recognized something unusual in him, a quality of mind that seemed to grasp concepts that other students struggled with for months or years. The Industrial Revolution was already reshaping Europe, and in Graz, a city of considerable technological advancement, the young Tesla encountered machinery, understood how it worked, began to dream of improvements and innovations. After Graz, he went to Prague to continue his education, and it was during these student years that the foundational knowledge accumulated, not just in the formal sense of classroom learning, but in the deeper sense of how his mind worked, how he thought, what his imagination was capable of. In 1882, at the age of 26, Tesla was walking in a public park in Budapest with a friend, Professor Ányos Jedlik, on an evening in early February. It was the time of sunset, that liminal hour when day transitions to darkness, when the sky is suffused with violet and gold light. Tesla had been working on problems related to motors and rotating magnetic fields, concepts that had vexed the greatest electrical engineers of the age. The mathematics seemed impossibly complex, the practical realization seemed impossible, and yet he carried it with him constantly, a weight of unresolved questions that occupied every waking moment. As he walked, he began to recite passages from Goethe's Faust, a book that had always moved him profoundly, that seemed to speak to something in his soul. And in that moment, as the dying light caught the landscape around him, and the ancient words of Goethe filled his mind, the entire problem suddenly, completely, resolved itself. He perceived it not as a mathematical equation, but as a vivid image, a vision of perfect clarity. He could see the rotating magnetic field, not theoretically, but visually, spatially, as if it were actually there before him, spinning and humming with invisible force. With a stick, he drew the diagram in the dirt of the path, sketching the fundamental insight that would eventually light up the world. His friend watched in confusion as Tesla drew and explained, the words pouring out of him, the excitement almost overwhelming. What had come to him in that moment was not merely a solution to a technical problem. It was something far more profound, a perception of how nature actually works, a glimpse into the underlying order of the physical universe. The rotating magnetic field was not something he had invented. It was something that had always existed, and he had simply perceived it, understood it, channeled it. The feeling was one of absolute certainty. There was no doubt, no uncertainty, no need for further verification. He simply knew that this was correct, that this would work, that this would transform everything. The years in Paris unfolded like a dream half remembered upon waking, beautiful in their surfaces yet shadowed by an inchoate frustration that Tesla could never quite name in the letters he wrote home. He had come to the Continental Edison Company in 1882 with the certainty that European engineering would recognize in him a kindred spirit, that the old world's great capitals would be the natural stage for his revolutionary ideas. Instead, he found himself in a modest workshop on the outskirts of the city, tasked with the methodical repair and installation of dynamos, useful work, honest work, but work that consumed his mind without expanding it. The Paris that greeted him mornings was a city of gaslit streets and horse-drawn carriages, of boulevards lined with limestone buildings that rose like pale monuments, to a Europe that was civilized, yes, infinitely cultured, but somehow frozen in time. He would walk the Rue de Rivoli and marvel at the architectural symmetry, at the way the lamplight pooled on wet cobblestones after rain, yet beneath the beauty lay a nagging sense of stagnation. The engineers around him, learned and accomplished men, seemed satisfied with incremental improvements to dynamos, with adjusting brush contacts and regulating voltage by hand. They had perfected the art of mechanical compromise, of making Edison's direct current systems work adequately in a world where adequate had somehow become the standard. Tesla, who carried in his mind the complete vision of rotating fields and polyphase alternation, who could see with perfect clarity the architecture of a motor that did not yet exist, felt the peculiar torment of the prophet in a land that treasured its past more than it imagined its future. The continental workshops were dark and cramped, smelling of machine oil and the peculiar sweetness of ozone that arose from the dynamo's brushes. His colleagues would gather for midday meals in cafes where the waiters knew their names, and they would discuss the latest technical journals and the gossip of engineering circles. Yet when Tesla spoke of his visions, of motors that could run on alternating current, of the elegant mathematics that governed them. He saw in their eyes a polite incomprehension, the way one might regard a man describing colours to the blind. He began to understand that Paris, for all its grandeur, was not the city where his future would unfold. The brilliance of European culture was real and undeniable, yet it belonged to a world that was passing away, and Tesla's ideas belonged to a world that had not yet been born. The gaslit streets, however lovely, were the streets of yesterday. Somewhere across the Atlantic, he came to believe, in a rawer, more urgent place, the future was being built by men hungry enough to embrace it. From that moment forward, Tesla's life had a direction, a purpose that superseded all other considerations. He would take this insight and develop it, perfect it, bring it into the world. He secured a position with the Central Telegraph Office in Budapest and began to conduct experiments in any available space, working with whatever equipment he could acquire or improvise. His reputation grew among the technical community. He was recognized as someone with an unusual gift for seeing solutions where others saw only intractable problems. He attracted the attention of investors and engineers who understood the potential of his ideas, though he himself remained somewhat apart from the commercial world, more interested in the pure problem-solving than in questions of money or propriety. In 1884, at the age of 28, Tesla resolved to emigrate to America. America was the land of opportunity, where the machine age was advancing most rapidly, where fortunes were being made by those with innovative minds and the courage to pursue their visions. He arranged to meet with Thomas Alva Edison, a man already famous throughout the world as the inventor of the electric light and as a central figure in the emerging electrical industry. Edison's company, Edison Electric Light Company, was becoming one of the most powerful concerns in America. The introduction was arranged through a letter of recommendation from one of Tesla's contacts in Europe. With this letter in hand, with his skills and his revolutionary insight into alternating current motors, with the burning confidence that his ideas would change the world, Tesla boarded a ship and sailed across the Atlantic toward his destiny. He arrived in New York with 4 cents in his pocket, wearing clothes that were worn and travel-stained, carrying nothing but his knowledge and his absolute conviction that he had something of immense value to offer to the world that awaited him. But the idea that struck Tesla in that park, the rotating magnetic field, would not just change his life. It would change the way every human being on Earth lives, works, and sleeps. It would alter the distribution of power across continents. It would make possible the transmission of electricity over vast distances, the creation of cities illuminated by artificial light, the eventual emergence of a world connected by invisible currents of energy flowing through the air and the earth. And it would set him on a collision course with the most powerful man in America, a man who had already shaped the electrical future according to his own vision, and who would not accept challenge to his supremacy without a fight that would test the very foundations of American commerce and conscience. New York in the winter of 1884 was a city of noise and chaos and incomprehensible velocity. The streets were crowded with the poor and the ambitious, with carriages and carts and pedestrians moving in what seemed like complete disorder. The air was thick with coal smoke. The buildings rose higher than any Tesla had ever seen. The sheer density of human ambition and mechanical power was overwhelming. Coming from the quiet of his contemplative years in Europe, the assault on his senses was almost unbearable. He found lodging in a boarding house of unspeakable squalor, where men slept in shifts on straw mattresses, where the smell of humanity and refuse was never entirely absent. During the day, he made his way to the Edison workshops, clutching his letter of introduction, burning with the knowledge that he had something extraordinary to offer. Edison received him, though not with great warmth. Edison was a man of action, of practical results, of results that could be demonstrated and sold. He was not particularly interested in theories or abstract principles. He was interested in what worked, and what worked for him. What had made him rich and famous was the direct current system, the system of electrical distribution that he had pioneered and that was already becoming the standard throughout America. In this system, electricity flowed in one direction, from the power plant to the homes and factories that used it. It was safe, or at least it seemed safe. It was controllable. It was Edison's system, his patent, his profits. Tesla, by contrast, was proposing alternating current, electricity that reversed direction many times per second, flowing backward and forward in a continuous oscillation. To Edison, this seemed not just inferior, but actually dangerous. To Tesla, it was elegant, efficient, practical, and absolutely the future. Edison put Tesla to work, but not in the way Tesla had imagined. He was assigned menial tasks, wiring, troubleshooting, the kind of work that any apprentice might do. Edison made vague promises about compensation and about the future opportunities that might arise, but he was testing Tesla, observing him, using his talent without according him the recognition that Tesla believed he deserved. Tesla threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. He redesigned components to be more efficient. He improved the machinery. He solved problems that had been vexing the workshop. But Edison did not value these contributions in the way that Tesla valued them. To Edison, Tesla was simply another engineer, another brain to be used and discarded if it did not serve his purposes. The workshop at Menlo Park was a cathedral of industry, if cathedrals reeked of sulphur and heated copper. Edison had built his laboratory complex as a kind of intellectual fortress, and to work within it was to exist in a state of controlled chaos that was entirely deliberate, the great inventor's way of keeping his mind perpetually stimulated by the unexpected. The air itself seemed charged, not merely with electricity but with a kind of barely contained ambition. Furnaces burned day and night. The smell of chemicals, phosphorus, sulphur, various compounds bubbling in glass vessels, created an almost hallucinatory atmosphere, especially for those men who worked the night shifts under the yellow glow of arc lamps. The heat from the machinery was relentless, intensifying during summer months until the workshop became an almost infernal space, where sweat poured freely and shirts clung to skin like a second dermis. Edison moved through this world like a conductor orchestrating controlled pandemonium, and his philosophy of invention was as much a part of the atmosphere as the chemical vapours. Try everything, record what works, discard what doesn't, and repeat. He believed in the power of sheer persistence, of testing 10,000 materials until one proved superior, of documenting failures with the same meticulous care as successes, because failure, properly understood, was just information. The engineers and assistants who surrounded him had been selected for their willingness to embrace this methodology, and there existed among them a peculiar competitive tension, each man wanting to be the one who made the next great discovery, who caught Edison's attention and favour. They would work in parallel on different problems, sometimes collaborating, sometimes racing against one another, in an undeclared but entirely understood competition for resources and recognition. Tesla found this world alien and deeply troubling. Where Edison saw in a problem a puzzle to be solved through empirical trial, Tesla saw a problem that could be understood, in principle, through first mathematics, that could be solved on paper before a single tool was lifted. Edison's method was intuitive, practical, rooted in the craftsman's tradition. Tesla's was theoretical, rooted in the mathematician's and physicist's understanding of universal principles. Edison looked at the world and asked, what does it do? Tesla asked, what must it be? The philosophical gulf between them was not merely professional, but fundamental. A collision between two entirely different ways of comprehending reality. Edison seemed to regard Tesla's theoretical approach as a kind of pretentious indulgence, a luxury that practical men could not afford. Why spend weeks calculating electromagnetic fields when you could spend a week testing different configurations and get an answer faster? Why theorize about the nature of alternating current when direct current was already working, already installed, already profitable? Edison was not unkind, exactly, but he was impatient with those who could not operate at his speed and by his methods. He would appear in the workshop at odd hours, observe the work underway, ask sharp questions that cut to the heart of what was being attempted, and his comments, whether praise or criticism, shaped the entire atmosphere of the place. For Tesla, used to solitude and deep contemplation, used to visualizing complete systems before construction, the noise and chaos and constant activity of the Menlo Park workshop felt like intellectual quicksand, and beneath it all lay a subtler conflict. Tesla understood that Edison's triumph was not inevitable, that the direct current system was fundamentally limited, that the future belonged to alternating current and polyphase distribution. Yet Edison's authority was so total, his patents so extensive, his influence over the direction of electrical development so complete, that speaking these truths aloud seemed not only futile but almost insubordinate. When Tesla finally brought the question of compensation to Edison, the conversation turned bitter. Edison made it clear that he did not believe in the kind of payment he had apparently promised. He invoked the concept of American humor, the idea that a gentleman from Europe might not understand the joking, casual way that Americans made agreements. Tesla, insulted and enraged, left Edison's employ. The friendship had never really existed, only the mutual delusion that it might. Edison, for his part, had recognized in Tesla a genuine talent, but he also recognized a threat. Tesla's ideas about alternating current, if they proved viable, would undermine everything Edison had built. The best way to deal with a threat was to suppress it, to discredit it, to destroy it before it could grow. For a period that Tesla would always remember with pain and humiliation, he took work digging ditches, laying electrical cables beneath the streets of New York. This work, which would have been demeaning to a man of lesser character, nearly broke Tesla's spirit entirely. He suffered from illness, from depression, from the overwhelming sense that his great destiny had been a delusion, that he had come to America only to be exploited and then discarded. He lived in poverty that made his early boarding house seem luxurious. He survived on the kindness of acquaintances. There were moments when he was not certain that he would survive at all. The winter of 1885 descended on New York like a judgment. Tesla, having left Edison's employ, found himself in a state of near destitution, without position, without patronage. His grand plans for demonstrating his polyphase system stalled indefinitely. The savings he had accumulated during his meagre salary at Menlo Park had evaporated into the void of living expenses and failed patent applications. He needed work, any work, and the city, brutal and efficient in the way only American cities could be, offered him employment of the most elementary kind. He took a job with the Western Union Telegraph Company, digging ditches through the frozen earth of New York streets, laying the copper wires that would connect the city to itself. It is difficult to overstate the profound strangeness of this circumstance, the almost cosmic indignity of it. Here was a man who had mastered the theoretical principles governing the transformation and transmission of electrical energy, who could visualize in perfect detail the rotating magnetic fields that would power the industrial future, reduced to manual labor in the cruelest season of the year. His hands, which had been soft from years of intellectual work, began to blister and then callous, the skin thickening against the wooden handle of the shovel. The cold was absolute and unyielding. The temperature on particularly brutal mornings would drop to 20 degrees below zero, and the earth would be iron hard, resisting the spade with the stubbornness of a living thing. The work was performed in darkness, beginning before dawn and ending after the light had fled, a perpetual twilight that seemed to steal something essential from the human spirit. Tesla would work alongside Italian and Irish immigrants, men whose faces were weathered by decades of outdoor labor, who spoke a dozen different languages and seemed to regard the cold with the fatalistic acceptance of those who had never known another life. He kept his silence mostly, spoke little, endured the physical pain with a kind of grim stoicism, and tried not to think about the years he had spent in study, the theories he had developed in solitude, the vision that burned in his mind with undiminished intensity, the sounds of 1880s New York, the clang of horse-drawn carts on cobblestone, the shriek of the elevated trains that moved like iron spiders across the sky on their trestle work, the shouting of street vendors and the endless percussion of the city's self-construction, surrounded him during work and followed him afterward into the boarding houses and cheap hotels where he rented small rooms. The smell of the streets in winter had its own character. The sharp tang of horse manure mixing with smoke from thousands of chimneys, the stench of human sewage and industrial effluent, the peculiar metallic odour of cold air itself, which seemed almost to have a flavour when you breathed it. His body ached in ways he had not known were possible. Muscles he had never consciously used developed and burned, and refused to cooperate fully even after hours of sleep. And yet, and this was the quality that would define much of his character, he did not break. The irony was not lost on him, though he rarely allowed himself to contemplate it directly, that a man who understood the deepest principles of electromagnetic induction, who had already conceived of motors and transformers that would eventually remake the world, should be spending his days in manual drudgery, his nights in small cold rooms, his future utterly uncertain. But beneath the physical suffering was a resolve that hardened rather than weakened. The world had not yet recognized what he was, but it would. He had only to survive long enough, and yet from this darkness, salvation came. A man named Alfred S. Brown, an engineer and businessman, encountered Tesla and recognized something in him. Recognized the quality of mind, the seriousness of purpose, the genuineness of his ideas. Brown became interested in Tesla and in his alternating current designs. Through Brown, Tesla was introduced to Charles F. Peck, an investor and businessman. Together, these two men became convinced that Tesla's vision was sound, that alternating current was not merely a theoretical possibility but a practical reality that could be commercialized. They provided him with funding and with laboratory space. They protected him from the further predations of Edison and of others who saw him as a threat or simply as someone to be used. With their support, Tesla was able to conduct proper experiments, to refine his designs, to prove that his revolutionary system could actually work. In 1887 and 1888, Tesla developed and patented a complete system of alternating current motors and distribution technology. These were not minor refinements to existing technology. They were genuinely revolutionary. They represented a different way of thinking about electrical power, a different understanding of how electricity could be harnessed and distributed. When George Westinghouse, a man of enormous wealth and industrial power, learned of Tesla's inventions, he immediately recognized their value. Westinghouse was a businessman and engineer who, unlike Edison, was interested in what was true and what worked, rather than merely in what served his existing interests. Westinghouse purchased the patent rights to Tesla's alternating current motors. In that moment, Tesla's fortunes changed. He was no longer a desperate emigrant clinging to survival. He was an inventor whose ideas had attracted the attention and the capital of one of the most powerful industrialists in America. But Edison was not a man who accepted defeat quietly, or who accepted threats to his dominion with grace. What he did next, what he was willing to do to destroy Tesla and alternating current, would be born not of reason or competition, but of fear and desperation. Edison's system of direct current was already being built into the infrastructure of America, but it had fundamental limitations. Direct current could only be transmitted for a few miles before the electrical resistance in the wires caused too much power to be lost. This meant that power plants had to be close to the locations where power was used. It meant that large cities required many power plants. It meant that the system could not be easily expanded or scaled. Alternating current, by contrast, could be transmitted over much longer distances using transformers. It meant that a few large power plants could supply electricity to entire regions. It meant that Edison's system would eventually become obsolete, and that all the capital he had invested in his direct current infrastructure would become worthless. To defend his investment, to protect his dominion, Edison launched what would become known as the War of Currents, a campaign of propaganda, intimidation, and violence designed to make the public believe that alternating current was dangerous and that direct current was safe. He invited journalists and skeptics to his laboratory, where he would demonstrate the dangers of alternating current by electrocuting animals, dogs and cats and horses, sometimes even other animals, using the alternating current supplied by Westinghouse's generators. The animals would convulse and die in agony, and the newspapers would report on these exhibitions, each death a piece of propaganda against Tesla's system. The message was clear: alternating current kills. Alternating current is dangerous. Alternating current is the instrument of death. Edison extended this logic to its most grotesque expression. He campaigned to have alternating current used for capital punishment. He worked with the state of New York to develop an electric chair, a device that would execute convicted criminals using alternating current. The implicit message was obvious. Alternating current was so dangerous that it was fit only for executing murderers. In 1890, William Kemmler, who had been convicted of murder, became the first person executed by electric chair. The execution was botched. The initial charge did not kill him, and he had to be subjected to a second application of current, but it served Edison's purpose. It created a public perception that alternating current was inherently dangerous, that it was the instrument of death, that only an enemy of humanity would promote such a technology, and yet the logic of physics and of economics could not be denied forever. Alternating current was superior. It could do things that direct current could not. It could be transmitted over distances. It could power motors more efficiently. It was the future. The question was not whether alternating current would eventually dominate, but whether Edison could delay that future long enough to protect his investments and his wealth. The crucial test came in 1893, when the World's Columbian Exposition was being built in Chicago. The exposition was one of the largest and most ambitious projects undertaken in America, a vast display of American achievement and modernity, visited by millions of people, a showcase of what the nation could accomplish. The question of how the exposition would be lit and powered became a contest between Edison's direct current system and Westinghouse's alternating current system. If alternating current could illuminate the exposition, if it could power the displays and the machinery, then the public would see with their own eyes that it was safe, that it worked, that Edison's propaganda campaign was simply the desperate flailing of a man trying to protect an obsolete technology. Westinghouse bid for the contract to light the exposition. Edison bid as well. In the end, Westinghouse's bid was accepted, not because it was dramatically cheaper, though it was, but because it was recognized that alternating current was the system of the future. Westinghouse and Tesla, together with a team of the finest engineers in America, undertook the task of illuminating the world's Columbian Exposition with alternating current. Tesla designed the systems, oversaw the technical implementation, and on opening night in 1893, as President Grover Cleveland pressed a button, over 100,000 electric lights illuminated the exposition. The night became as bright as day. The crowds gasped. For the first time in human history, a space of that magnitude had been artificially lit by electric current. It was beautiful. It was miraculous. It was proof that Westinghouse and Tesla had not merely been theoretically correct. They had demonstrated it practically, publicly, in a way that millions of people could witness and understand. The White City rose from the shores of Lake Michigan like a vision made manifest, and Tesla, standing among the crowds that pressed through its gates during the summer of 1893, felt something like vindication flowing through him. The world's Columbian Exposition was an architectural fantasy, impossibly white, impossibly grand, impossibly clean in a way that the real cities of America were not. The buildings, constructed mostly of plaster of Paris over iron frames, glowed with an otherworldly luminosity in the daylight and took on an almost supernatural quality when the sun descended and the electric lights blazed to life. This was the fruits of Westinghouse's backing, the public embodiment of Tesla's triumph. The polyphase current that powered this entire temporary city, the alternating current that hummed through invisible wires beneath the grounds, that turned the motors which drove the fountains and the mechanical attractions. Walking through the exposition grounds at dusk was to inhabit a temporary world where electricity had been made so abundant, so ubiquitous, that it had begun to seem not like technology, but like magic. The gondolas floated through the lagoons, their passages guided by electric motors that operated with a smoothness and silence that would have been impossible with the reciprocating engines of the direct current era. The Ferris wheel rose against the darkening sky like the construction of an impossible dream, a vast circle of iron and human ingenuity, each car capable of holding dozens of people, rotating on axes greased and true. And when night came fully, the lights would ignite. Hundreds of thousands of incandescent bulbs, strung in patterns across the facades of the buildings, illuminated by alternating current flowing from a generating station that stood somewhere out of sight, sending power through wires in quantities that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The effect was not merely beautiful but transformative. The crowds, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people from across the country, wandered through an environment that seemed to belong to the future, that seemed to suggest in every detail that electricity would not merely light homes and power machines, but would ultimately remake human civilization itself. The air itself seemed to carry a charge of possibility. Tesla moved through these spaces with a strange mixture of emotions, profound satisfaction at the vindication of his theories and almost delirious joy at seeing his vision instantiated at such scale and in such public view, and beneath it all a quiet melancholy, an awareness that he had been forced to share the stage and the credit with others, that Westinghouse and his engineers had transformed Tesla's theoretical work into this practical triumph. But standing before the great wheel as it rotated against the star-filled sky, feeling the motion in his bones, hearing the mechanical precision of it, he allowed himself a moment of pure contentment. The future he had envisioned was here, visible, real, no longer merely a phantom dancing in his mind. The White City would fade away, The temporary structures would be dismantled, but the technology that powered it would remain, would spread, would become the foundation upon which the new century would be built. He was not merely vindicated, he was proven absolutely right, and the world, or at least a significant portion of it, could see it now with their own eyes. Edison's campaign of fear had been defeated not by argument but by demonstration. The people had seen. The question of which system would power America's future had been answered, but the greatest test was yet to come. The hydroelectric power station at Niagara Falls, one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever attempted, required a decision. Would it be built using direct current or alternating current? The power of the falls was immense, far beyond what any local power plant could produce. The transmission of that power to Buffalo and to New York City would require technology that could transmit electricity over distances. Only alternating current could do this. Only Westinghouse and Tesla's system had the capability to harness the power of Niagara Falls and distribute it across a region. In 1895, the Niagara Falls power station began operation, generating electricity from the falling water, transforming it through Westinghouse's transformers, and transmitting it via alternating current to cities and towns across the region. The future had arrived. Alternating current had won. The war of currents was over. The turbines at Niagara Falls represented a different order of magnitude entirely from anything Tesla had yet encountered. These were not theoretical constructs or laboratory demonstrations, but massive machines, each weighing hundreds of tons, engineered to harness the raw kinetic energy of a cataract that fell 188 feet with the force of millions of cubic feet of water flowing past every second. Tesla had seen the technical drawings and specifications, had studied the plans for the installation, but standing before the actual machinery, the massive shafts, the bronze bearings, the intricate systems of gearing and transformation, was to apprehend the true scale of what had been accomplished. The noise was extraordinary, a constant roar that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the bones and viscera. The falls themselves produced a bass rumble that was almost felt rather than heard, the percussion of immeasurable tons of water in perpetual descent. Beneath this lay the mechanical screaming of the turbines, the grinding of the gears, the metallic shriek of the generators as they spun at hundreds of revolutions per minute. The air was thick with mist and spray, a fine rain of water molecules created by the violent passage of the falls against themselves, and it seemed almost impossible that electrical equipment could function reliably in such an environment. Yet the apparatus had been designed with a precision and foresight that made it wholly adequate to the task. The moisture hung in the air and clung to skin and clothing. The temperature was dramatically lower than the ambient air, the spray itself seeming to carry the essential coldness of water in its constant transformation from liquid to vapour. Standing on the observation platform near the generators, one was enveloped in a kind of atmospheric chaos, a sensory overload that seemed almost to validate the magnitude of the forces being controlled and channeled. And then came the moment when the installation was completed and the current began to flow. The polyphase current, the alternating current that had been Tesla's vision and passion, began its journey through the copper transmission lines that stretched across the landscape toward Buffalo, carrying with it the potential to light homes and power factories across an entire region. On the streets of Buffalo, 30 miles away, on a November evening in 1896, the lights came on. Thousands of them, incandescent bulbs glowing in shop windows and along the great avenues, electric arc lamps illuminating the sidewalks with a brilliance that seemed to announce to the world that a new age had begun. The people of the city, who had walked by gaslight and lived within the constraints that limited electrical power imposed, suddenly found themselves in an environment where electricity was abundant enough to be profligate, enough to light the entire public sphere. Some stood in the streets and simply watched, unable to quite comprehend the transformation. Others gathered in groups, pointing out the new electric lights to children, speaking in voices filled with wonder about what it all meant. For those who understood the technical achievement, there was a different kind of joy. The knowledge that Tesla's system, his polyphase alternating current, his vision of wireless energy transmission and universal power distribution, had been proven not merely theoretically sound, but practically triumphant. The lights of Buffalo, blazing against the November darkness, were the physical instantiation of an idea that had lived first in the mind of a single man, an idea he had been willing to sacrifice his comfort, his security, his very health to bring into being. In those lights, the future had become the present. But Edison was not defeated in the way that history books sometimes suggest. He remained wealthy. He remained famous. He remained powerful. And Tesla, despite his triumph, despite having been vindicated by history and by the physical world itself, would find that victory in the marketplace of ideas does not necessarily translate to personal success or security. The forces that had tried to destroy him would find other ways to undermine him, to limit his influence, to prevent his ideas from reaching their full fruition. But that is a story for later. For now, in the darkness of the night, let us recognize that Tesla had achieved something unprecedented. He had transformed the electrical future of the world. His ideas, his vision, his understanding of how electricity could be harnessed and distributed had been proven correct. He had survived his struggle with Edison. He had vindicated his system, and though he did not yet know it, his greatest achievements, his most transformative inventions, were still ahead of him. If you're new here, welcome to the Calm Archive. A new sleep story arrives every single night. Subscribe so you never miss one, and let's follow Tesla across the Atlantic into the heart of the machine age. When Edison's light bulbs finally surrendered to the alternating current, when the last gaslight flicked out, and the great cities of America blazed with Tesla's invisible waves of power, the world did not know it had been saved by a man in a dark suit who believed that electricity could think. The war of currents, as historians would later call it, was over, and Tesla had won. It was 1896, and at Niagara Falls, where the thunder of water had been making music for millions of years, engineers were preparing to capture that ancient song and transform it into light. The hydroelectric plant at Niagara Falls was not merely a building, not merely a collection of turbines and generators spinning in the mist. It was a threshold. It was the moment when humanity stopped burning dinosaurs and started dancing with the forces that moved mountains. 2 great turbines, each producing 5,000 horsepower, each generating electricity through alternating current. Tesla's invention, the system he had designed, the vision he had carried like a secret code in his mind, began their work. The plant was 17 miles from Buffalo, a city that glowed on the horizon like an ember waiting to be fanned into flame. When the first switches closed in the cavernous room filled with the smell of ozone and machine oil, when the first current travelled through copper wires stretched across that impossible distance of 26 miles, the lights of Buffalo blazed on. Street lamps illuminated in ordered rows like a conductor raising his baton. Buildings transformed from shadows into architecture. The homes of 40,000 people suddenly held light at the flick of a switch. And in that moment, everything changed. This was not the flickering local electricity of Edison's direct current systems, where every block needed its own generator, where the energy dissipated like heat from a cooling iron. This was power flowing across distances that should have been impossible. This was the future, and it moved in alternating waves. The newspapers called it miracle, the electrical engineers called it validation, and Tesla, watching from New York, understood that he had just lit a match that would burn for 100 years. The fame that followed was intoxicating and disorienting in equal measure. Suddenly, the man who had spent his 20s and 30s in obscurity, who had lived in modest boarding houses and cheap hotels, who had survived on the patronage of men like Westinghouse, who believed in his vision before the world did, was being invited to the finest restaurants in Manhattan. Delmonico's, that temple of American wealth and appetite, saw him at its tables, this lean man with piercing eyes and an almost frightening presence. He would sit with his water glass and his carefully measured portions, speaking in that strange accent that was neither quite American nor quite anything else, and powerful men would listen. Mark Twain knew him. Mark Twain, that chronicler of American dreams and delusions, that man who had written about rivers and fraud and the human capacity for reinvention, became his friend. They would talk for hours about electricity and magnetism, about the nature of energy, about the possibility that consciousness itself might be a form of electromagnetic vibration. Twain was drawn to Tesla's vision of a world where energy moved through the air, like thoughts move through the mind, invisible and instantaneous. And Tesla found in Twain a kindred spirit, a man who understood that the greatest inventions are not machines but ideas, and that ideas, once released, propagate endlessly. In the glittering heart of New York's social world, Nikola Tesla became a figure of inexplicable fascination. The mysterious inventor whose very presence seemed to electrify a room, yet who remained fundamentally unknowable. The invitation to Delmonico's, the restaurant where the city's elite gathered to dine and scheme and celebrate their dominion over industry, came frequently to Tesla's apartment. He would attend these dinners dressed impeccably in his dark suits, his tall frame moving through the crowded rooms with the careful precision of a man navigating a world he observed rather than inhabited. The conversation would swirl around him, about money, about politics, about the great fortunes being made and lost on Wall Street. But Tesla seemed always slightly apart, as though listening to a different frequency entirely, hearing the hum of some vast machinery that only he could perceive. His hosts found him simultaneously indispensable and unsettling. The brilliant eccentric whose mere attendance lent cachet to an evening, yet whose silences could stretch uncomfortably long, his pale blue eyes fixed on something beyond the candlelit tables. It was Stanford White, the architect whose soaring visions had begun to reshape the skyline of Manhattan, who perhaps came closest to understanding Tesla's peculiar genius. They would meet for hours, and White, who moved comfortably among artists and dreamers, seemed to speak Tesla's language of grand ambition and aesthetic perfection. They discussed the future together, not merely the buildings White would design or the inventions Tesla would create, but the very nature of beauty and function intertwined, the way a structure could be simultaneously a work of art and a machine for living. Yet even White could not fully bridge the gap between Tesla's internal universe and the external world, for while White could translate his visions into concrete and stone that others could see and touch, Tesla's greatest visions remained locked behind his eyes, translatable only through the medium of electricity and wireless transmission, things that were almost but not quite real to the men and women who gathered in those elegant dining rooms. The poets and artists who encountered Tesla at these gatherings found in him a kind of tragic kindred spirit. He understood, as they understood, that beauty and truth existed in realms beyond the material. He spoke of his work with the passion of an artist, not the cold calculation of a businessman. Yet there was something that kept him fundamentally isolated from even those who should have been his natural companions. He would decline invitations that he had accepted. He would disappear into his laboratory for weeks, emerging thinner, his suit hanging more loosely on his frame, his eyes rimmed with the shadow of sleepless nights. The dinners at Delmonico's continued, but Tesla attended them less frequently as the years progressed, as if he were slowly withdrawing from the world he had once, however tentatively, begun to inhabit. His dining habits became increasingly peculiar, more ritualistic in their precision. When he did eat in public, he required always the same table, the same arrangement of silverware, the same careful distance from other diners. He would specify which fork to use, which knife, insisting on a particular brand of water bottled from a specific spring. The waitstaff learned to prepare his settings with military exactitude, for any deviation would render the meal unacceptable, sending Tesla back to his solitary apartments, where he would take his nourishment alone, surrounded by his books and papers and the soothing hum of his electrical equipment. But most strikingly, and most painfully, he refused the simple human gesture of the handshake. His hands, those long sensitive instruments that had shaped so much of the modern world, remained always unclenched, always withdrawn, as if the very touch of another human being might interrupt some vital current flowing through him. This refusal, polite as it was performed, created a visible barrier between Tesla and even those who loved him, a physical manifestation of the spiritual distance that grew wider with each passing year. The famous inventor, the man who was revolutionizing the world, had created around himself a fortress of solitude, brick by brick, ritual by ritual, until he stood apart even in the midst of crowds, isolated by his own exacting standards, his own desperate need for control and order, in a world that seemed to him fundamentally chaotic and threatening. It was during these years that Tesla began his famous demonstrations. He would stand before audiences in theatres and lecture halls, in the drawing rooms of the wealthy, and he would do something that seemed to defy every instinct of survival. He would take electricity, the same force that Edison's engineers said would kill you instantly, the same power that had been executed criminals just years before, and he would pass it through his own body. "Watch closely," he would say to the assembled gasping crowd, and he would stand in a carefully calibrated electromagnetic field, his body glowing faintly in the dim light of the theatre, and electricity would flow through him like a ghost passing through a wall. His skin would shine, his hair would rise from his head, like he had been touched by divinity. Light would emanate from his fingertips. He was not performing for applause, though the applause came in waves that seemed to shake the theatre. He was demonstrating a principle, that electricity was not the wild, untamable thing that the public feared. It was comprehensible. It could be shaped. It could be made safe. It could be made to serve. It was a form of mastery, displayed before the world like a magician's trick, except it was not a trick. The electricity was real. The danger was real. And his confidence that he could control it was the realest thing of all. By 1899, Tesla was ready for something larger. He had proven his theories in the laboratory and in the streets of New York. He had won his war with Edison. He had lit Niagara Falls and sent that power across an impossible distance. But Tesla did not think in increments. He did not think in reasonable steps that built towards sensible conclusions. He thought in absolutes. And his absolute was this. If electricity could travel 26 miles through wires, why not send it across the entire world? Why not create a system of wireless power transmission that would blanket the Earth like sunlight? Why not make energy free, infinite, available to anyone, anywhere, at any time? It was this thought that drew him west, to Colorado Springs, high in the Rocky Mountains where the air was thin and the sky was vast, and the electromagnetic phenomena were, he believed, more pronounced. He arrived in May of 1899, and he immediately rented a plot of land and began construction on a laboratory that would become the most extraordinary workshop ever built outside of the imaginations of Jules Verne. The building itself was large, but it was what Tesla built inside it that transformed it into something else entirely. A workshop within a workshop, a temple to electricity. At the center of the laboratory stood what would become his masterpiece, the Colorado Springs Tesla coil. This was not the small demonstration device he had shown in New York. This was a massive construction, a secondary coil made of copper tubing spiraling upward, rising 20 feet into the air, and connected to a primary coil below it through a carefully calculated resonant frequency. When the primary coil was energized, when the alternating current pulsed through it at exactly the right frequency, the secondary coil would begin to vibrate at that same frequency, and the energy would climb higher and higher, building on itself, the voltage multiplying with each oscillation, until something extraordinary happened. Lightning. Not real lightning, not the kind that came from the sky, but artificial lightning, created by human hands, generated and controlled and directed by Tesla's will and knowledge. When Tesla threw the switches in the Colorado Springs laboratory, when he activated the great coil, witnesses said the experience was like being inside a thunderstorm. The air itself seemed to crack and split. The electricity would arc from the top of the secondary coil, reaching upward toward the copper plates mounted on the ceiling, and the sound would be like nothing on Earth. A roaring, crackling, keening sound, almost musical in its intensity, a sound that seemed to come from the sky itself. The bolts of artificial lightning would leap into the air, blue-white and impossibly bright, visible for miles across the Colorado plains. On nights when Tesla was running his experiments, the entire landscape for miles around would be illuminated as if by a supernatural sun. The locals were terrified. There were stories of horses going mad in the fields when the electrical storms began. There were reports of people feeling electricity in their teeth, their hair standing on end as the massive electromagnetic fields swept across the countryside. Some people left town entirely, convinced that Tesla had opened a door between worlds, that he was summoning forces that should not be summoned. The local newspaper, the Colorado Springs Gazette, published warnings about the mad scientist on the hill, though not all of the coverage was critical. Some of it was simply awed. How could a human being create such power? How could he stand in the center of such forces without being destroyed? Tesla's life in Colorado became increasingly isolated. He worked at night mostly, when the electromagnetic conditions seemed optimal to him. He would spend his days in correspondence, in planning, in the meticulous calculations that occupied his mind like a chess grandmaster, contemplating an infinite board. He ate nothing, or almost nothing. He slept in fractured intervals. He was existing on a diet of coffee and electrical current, as if the waves that surrounded him had become his only sustenance. And in the evenings, he would go to the laboratory, and he would throw the switches, and the mountains of Colorado would split open with light. It was during this period that Tesla began to make a claim that even his most devoted admirers found difficult to believe. He said he was receiving signals from Mars. He said that the electromagnetic phenomena he was observing in his experiments were not random or natural, but that they possessed a pattern, a structure, an intentionality that suggested they were communications from another world. He published a report claiming that he had detected signals that could only have been generated by an intelligent civilization on the Red Planet. He said the civilization was trying to reach Earth, and he, Tesla, had become the first human being to understand and receive their message. The scientific community was baffled. Some thought he was a genius finally making contact with the cosmic order. Others thought he was losing his mind, that the isolation and the constant exposure to electromagnetic fields had fractured something in his psyche. The truth, as with so much about Tesla, lay somewhere in the space between. He was probably picking up radio waves, reflections and refractions of electromagnetic signals bouncing through the thin mountain air, but in interpreting them, in constructing meaning from the noise, he was also doing what every human being does when they contemplate something vast and unknown. He was projecting his hopes onto an indifferent universe. He was imagining contact because he was perhaps so desperately lonely that he needed to believe that somewhere out there, something else was trying to speak with him. The Colorado Springs laboratory sat high in the thin mountain air, where the atmosphere itself seemed to vibrate at a different frequency, where the sky stretched impossibly vast and the horizon curved away in every direction. Tesla had chosen this isolation deliberately, seeking altitude and distance, a place where his experiments would not interfere with the electrical systems of a major city, where he could push his equipment to its limits without restraint. The laboratory became his entire universe, a wooden structure filled with elaborate apparatus, coils and condensers and transformers, arranged with meticulous care, everything precisely positioned according to calculations that existed nowhere but in Tesla's mind. The walls themselves seemed to hum with potential, as if the very structure had become an extension of his vision, a physical manifestation of electrical principles he was only beginning to understand. The days in Colorado Springs fell into a rhythm dictated by Tesla's obsessive nature and his need to extract every possible secret from the phenomena he was studying. He would work through the morning hours, making observations, adjusting equipment, running calculations. By afternoon he would retire to rest, but only briefly, only as much as was absolutely necessary to sustain his body for the greater work that awaited. As evening fell and darkness gathered in the mountains, the laboratory would come alive in ways that seemed almost supernatural to anyone who might have witnessed them. Tesla would begin his nighttime experiments, driving his equipment to ever greater intensities, pushing the boundaries of what was electrically possible. The apparatus would sing with increasing power, the sound building from a whisper to a roar, a sound like the world itself was being torn apart and remade. The equipment generated frequencies beyond the human range of hearing, but audible to him in some deeper way, through his bones and his nerve endings, through the very electricity that he believed animated life itself. The air in the laboratory took on a quality that was almost tangible, heavy with ozone, that sharp, clean smell of electrical discharge that filled every corner, every crevice. Mixed with it came the acrid scent of hot copper and burning insulation, the smell of equipment pushed to its absolute limits. Tesla moved through this atmosphere like a man in a trance, his white shirt darkening with sweat despite the cool mountain nights, his thin hair standing on end from the electrical fields that surrounded him, his entire body seemingly electrified by the work he was doing. The local residents, living in the town below, began to notice the strange phenomena. They would see the laboratory outlined in brilliant light at midnight, would hear the peculiar humming that seemed to emanate from the mountain itself. Some were fascinated, drawn to observe from a distance the strange glowing structure where the eccentric inventor conducted his mysterious work. Others were fearful, spreading rumors of dangerous experiments, of Tesla trying to capture lightning itself, of mysterious rays that might bring illness or madness. Tesla's isolation was profound, almost complete. He had brought with him one assistant and a few workers to maintain the equipment, but they spoke to him rarely, intimidated by his fierce concentration, by the casual way he discussed phenomena that seemed impossible, that defied the very laws of nature as they understood them. The sounds of the laboratory created a kind of symphony that only Tesla could fully comprehend. The deep throb of the generators, the sharp crack of sparks leaping between electrodes, the peculiar singing of the coils as they resonated at their natural frequencies. High overhead, the stars wheeled through the clear mountain sky, indifferent to the activities below, while inside the laboratory, Tesla conducted his midnight performances like a conductor leading an orchestra of electrical forces. He was chasing something just beyond the reach of his instruments, something he could almost perceive, almost touch. He believed that in these moments, in the height of these experiments, he was approaching an understanding of the universe's deepest secrets, that he was translating the language of nature itself. The laboratory walls echoed with his voice as he made notes, spoke to himself, worked through problems aloud. In those moments, Tesla existed in a state somewhere between ecstasy and agony, driven forward by a vision that had become more real to him than any physical object in the world, more tangible than food or sleep or human companionship. The laboratory crackled with electricity. The coils sang their strange songs. The lightning reached toward the sky like prayers from a mad god. And Tesla stood at the center of it all, thin and burning, his eyes bright with fever or vision or both, convinced that he stood at the threshold of something extraordinary. He believed that he had proven that wireless energy was possible. He believed that he had generated artificial lightning that would remain unmatched for decades. He believed that he had received signals from another world. But he believed something else too, something darker, something that would drive all his future work and consume everything he had built. He believed that he could change the world. He believed that he could transmit energy itself across any distance, that he could make electricity free for everyone, that he could accomplish what Edison had tried to do through commerce, bring light to the world. But unlike Edison, Tesla wanted to do it not for profit, but for love of humanity itself. This was his gift and his curse, this absolute conviction that technology should serve the greatest good of the greatest number. And this belief would soon lead him to New York, to Long Island, to a tower that would cost him everything. "You're doing beautifully staying with me through the storm. The mathematics of sleep are fascinating. They tell us that stories of ambition and electricity, of men who dreamed too large and lost everything, are somehow soothing to the mind. Perhaps because we recognize in them our own battles between grand vision and practical limitation. If the Calm Archive has become part of your nighttime routine, that subscribe button means more than you know. It means we can keep traveling back through history, finding these moments where human beings reach for something that might change everything. Now let's follow Tesla back to New York, where his greatest dream and his greatest nightmare were about to collide. Tesla returned to New York in 1900, and the world had changed in the months he had been away in Colorado. The industrial age had accelerated past him like a train he could no longer board. Morgan had survived. Westinghouse had survived. Edison, though diminished, had survived. But Tesla himself had not. Or rather, some part of him had remained behind in Colorado, in that laboratory where lightning reached toward Mars and electricity sang in the mountains. The man who arrived in New York was still Tesla, still brilliant, still possessed of that terrible clarity that had always defined his mind. But he was also becoming something else, a man obsessed with a single project, a man who believed that one more invention, one final tower, would change everything. It was this conviction that led him to propose his greatest project to the greatest financier in America. J.P. Morgan was not a man to be impressed easily. He had bought gold mines and railroads. He had arranged the finances of nations. He had survived panics and crashes and the constant tremor of a world in economic flux. But Morgan, for all his power, was a man who understood one essential truth. Power flows where the money is. And he was interested in Tesla because Tesla's alternating current system had proven that energy could flow without it being metered, without someone at the center of the transaction taking a cut. This terrified him, and it fascinated him. In 1901, Tesla approached Morgan and proposed something extraordinary, the Wardenclyffe Tower, a tower on Long Island, a massive structure that would serve as a transmitting station for wireless electricity. With this single tower, Tesla claimed, he could transmit power and communications across the Atlantic. Multiple towers, a network across the world, and all energy could be wireless. All electricity could be transmitted through the air like radio waves, like thoughts, like the signals he had received from Mars. Morgan listened. Morgan believed him enough to invest. Morgan provided a gift of $150,000, an enormous sum for the time, enough to build a kingdom of ambition. Construction began in 1901. The construction of the Wardenclyffe Tower began in the summer of 1901, and Tesla visited the site nearly every day, standing on the Long Island landscape as the structure rose steadily skyward, as if his will alone could draw it upward toward the heavens. The tower emerged from the earth through the dedicated labour of workers who did not entirely understand what they were building, who knew only that they were erecting an immense wooden lattice structure that would rise eventually to a height of nearly 200 feet, crowned with a great copper dome that gleamed in the summer sun like the cap of some vast mushroom reaching toward the sky. Tesla had designed every detail with his characteristic precision, the angle of the supports, the placement of each element, the exact specifications of the copper dome that would serve as the transmitting antenna, broadcasting wireless energy across the continental distance. He moved among the workers with an air of profound purpose, sketching corrections, pointing out adjustments, his eyes always fixed upward, always calculating, always envisioning the completed structure in its full glory. The foundation work had been the most critical phase, and Tesla had overseen it with particular intensity. Beneath the tower, extending deep into the Long Island soil, a vast system of tunnels had been constructed, creating a network that would distribute electrical current across a wider area, multiplying the power of the transmission system. These underground passages had a strange, hollow quality, filled with the scent of freshly turned earth and the cooling moisture of the depths. Tesla would descend into these tunnels regularly, walking their length by lamplight, running his hands along the copper plates and coils that had been installed, assuring himself that every connection was perfect, every measurement precise. The contrast between the brilliant daylight of the construction site above and the cool darkness of the underground chambers seemed to perfectly encapsulate the duality of his work. The visible tower reaching toward the sky, the invisible network of force burrowing into the Earth's depths. As the weeks passed and the tower rose higher, Tesla's excitement became almost palpable, radiating from him in the way his hands trembled when he discussed the upcoming experiments, in the way his voice took on a note of profound certainty when he spoke to the engineers about what would be possible once the transmitting apparatus was complete. He had become something of a celebrity in the region, a figure of curiosity and wonder. Local newspapers reported on the progress of the tower, speculating about what this mysterious inventor intended to accomplish. Tesla granted occasional interviews, but his explanations of the work seemed to baffle the journalists who tried to capture them in words for the general reader. He spoke of wireless transmission of power, of sending electrical energy across the distance without wires, of creating a global system that would render the traditional grid of wires and transformers obsolete. To most listeners, it sounded like fantasy, like the imaginings of a mind too brilliant for the practical world to accommodate. But to Tesla it was as certain as the sunrise. He could see it as clearly as the tower rising before his eyes, could perceive the moment when it would begin to function, when the invisible waves would begin to flow across the distances, carrying power and information to every corner of the globe. The conversations between Tesla and the engineers who supervised the construction took on an almost mystical quality as the work progressed. He would stand at the edge of the construction site pointing upward, describing the experiments that would soon be conducted, the way the tower would channel and focus electrical forces in ways that had never been attempted before. The engineers, practical men accustomed to the physics of gravity and stress and material resistance, would listen with a mixture of comprehension and bewilderment. Tesla spoke in a language that was partly scientific, partly visionary, creating in their minds images of a future that seemed possible, because this brilliant man with his precise calculations and his almost hypnotic certainty seemed to believe in it absolutely. They could see his passion, could feel his conviction radiating from him like the electrical fields he so frequently discussed. The tower itself became a symbol of possibility, a physical monument to human ambition and the power of imagination to reshape the world. Tesla visited it nearly every day, sometimes remaining for hours, sometimes returning in the evening to see it silhouetted against the darkening sky. That great wooden structure crowned with copper, rising toward the stars like a prayer made visible, like a bridge between earth and sky that he believed would soon transmit the very essence of power itself across the vast distances separating humanity. The tower itself was magnificent, a wooden structure nearly 200 feet tall, with a massive copper hemisphere at the top designed to resonate at the frequency Tesla had calculated. Around the base, a laboratory was built, reinforced and underground, where the machinery that would power the whole structure would hum with electricity. It was designed not just as a functional apparatus, but as a monument to Tesla's vision, a physical representation of the idea that energy could transcend distance, that the world could be united not by wires, but by invisible waves of power and information. For a time, it seemed possible. The construction advanced. The tower rose above the Long Island landscape, the machine shop filled with equipment. Tesla was pouring everything into this project: his time, his energy, his remaining fortune, and most importantly, his hope that this would be the work that finally proved his vision to the world. But then, in 1901, something happened that changed everything. Guglielmo Marconi, an Italian inventor who had built his work partly on patents that Tesla had developed and that others had refined, transmitted a radio signal across the Atlantic Ocean. It was a crude signal, just the letter S, repeated over and over. But it crossed the Atlantic. It proved that wireless communication was possible. The implications were immediate and devastating. If wireless communication could be accomplished with Marconi's system, then Tesla's more complex system of wireless power transmission seemed redundant. Worse, for Morgan, it meant that someone else had proven the principle first. Morgan, the financier, understood something about technology that Tesla, the pure scientist, did not. Technology that cannot be metered, that cannot be controlled, that cannot be made scarce, cannot be made profitable. If anyone could draw free power from the air, where did you put the meter? Where was the point of commerce? Where was the place where you collected the money that made the whole enterprise worthwhile? Marconi's system, by contrast, could be controlled. It required transmitters and receivers that could be licensed and sold. It could be made proprietary. It could be made profitable. Morgan lost interest. His letters to Tesla became less encouraging, more conditional. The funding that had seemed unlimited suddenly became contingent. Tesla wrote back, desperate letters explaining why the work was important, why it must continue, why the world needed wireless power transmission more than it needed anything else. Morgan's replies were polite, correct, final. The money was not coming. The tower stood unfinished on Long Island, incomplete and impossible, like some great prophecy that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Tesla's mental state, already fragile from years of overwork and isolation, began to crack further. He moved from laboratory to laboratory, from hotel to hotel, his obsession growing rather than diminishing. He could not stop thinking about the tower. He could not stop believing that with just a little more money, a little more time, he could complete it and change everything. He borrowed against his future. He called in every favour. He wrote letters to financiers and industrialists that ranged from eloquent to desperate. No one invested. No one believed. The tower remained unfinished for years, a skeletal structure against the Long Island sky, gathering rust and contempt from the world that had, for a moment, believed in Tesla's dream and then moved on. The letters began in the spring of 1902, careful and measured at first, then increasingly desperate, the handwriting gradually becoming more agitated, the words scratched across the paper with growing intensity. Tesla wrote to J. Pierpont Morgan, the man whose financial support had made the Wardenclyffe project possible, the man whose belief in Tesla's vision had unlocked the resources needed to transform it from dream into physical reality. At first, the letters were technical in nature, progress reports and optimistic assessments of the work's advancement. Tesla described the tower rising, outlined the experiments that would soon commence, discussed the magnificent future that would unfold once the transmission system was operational. Morgan's responses came regularly at first, brief notes offering encouragement, promising additional funds when they were needed. Tesla read and reread these notes, drawing from them the sustenance that kept him moving forward, the reassurance that the most powerful financial mind in America believed in what he was attempting. But gradually the tone of Morgan's communications changed. The notes became shorter, less frequent, then eventually ceased altogether. In response, Tesla's letters grew longer, more intricate in their arguments, more desperate in their pleas. He detailed for Morgan the progress being made, the proximity to breakthrough, the magnificent potential rewards that awaited. He explained the slight delays, the unexpected complications, the need for additional funds to complete certain aspects of the work. His handwriting, which had always been precise and controlled, began to show signs of stress, letters slanting more sharply, pressure applied more heavily, words occasionally crossed out in frustration and rewritten. The anxiety that had always been present in Tesla's personality, held in check by confidence and forward momentum, began to manifest itself in his correspondence. He began to sense something shifting, some withdrawal of confidence, some cooling in Morgan's regard. The silence that greeted his increasingly eloquent appeals was far more devastating than any explicit rejection could have been. Tesla's daily visits to the Wardenclyffe site continued, but they took on a different character as the summer of 1902 progressed into autumn, as the autumn faded toward winter. The tower stood nearly complete now, that great copper dome gleaming dully in the grey light of the shortened days, but the laboratory beneath it remained incomplete, the apparatus that would transform electrical current into wireless transmission not yet fully installed. The work slowed, then halted almost entirely as the funds that Morgan had promised began to dry up. The workers who had so eagerly engaged in the construction, who had taken pride in erecting this magnificent structure, began to drift away in search of other employment, of paychecks that would actually materialize. Tesla watched them depart with a growing sense of desolation. The structure that had represented possibility, achievement, the fulfillment of a vision, began to transform into something else entirely, a monument to failure, a physical embodiment of a dream interrupted, a tower standing incomplete against the sky. The laboratory itself grew quiet. The equipment that had been carefully positioned, the apparatus that Tesla had designed with such meticulous attention to detail, sat idle and gathering dust. Tesla would walk through the structure in the gathering darkness, his footsteps echoing in the empty spaces, the shadows growing longer as the winter days shortened. He continued to write letters to Morgan, but they took on a different tone now, a quality of desperation that was almost unbearable. The confident visionary who had once discussed wireless transmission with absolute certainty now found himself begging for recognition, for understanding, for one final injection of capital that would allow him to complete the work, to prove that his vision was not delusion, but scientific truth. The silence from Morgan's office was absolute and crushing. No replies came, no checks arrived, no message of encouragement penetrated the darkness that seemed to be closing in around Tesla's greatest dream. The unfinished tower stood against the sky like an accusation, a monument to ambition that had overreached, to vision that had exceeded the practical limits of finance and human belief. Tesla, who had once stood at the height of success, stood now at the threshold of ruin, and he could see with perfect clarity the moment when the dream had slipped from his grasp. The instant when the future he had been certain was approaching had turned instead toward irrelevance and oblivion. During the years that followed, Tesla's life became increasingly unstable. His mind, brilliant and ordered when it was focused on pure problems of physics and engineering, became fractured when confronted with the human realities of money and power. He became convinced that he had been betrayed, and this was not entirely wrong. He had been betrayed by a system that did not value generosity, betrayed by a culture that could not see the difference between an innovation that served humanity and an innovation that served only profit. But he had also betrayed himself, had held to a vision of the world that could never accommodate the actual world as it existed. And here is where the story of Nikola Tesla shifts from triumph to tragedy, not because his ideas failed, but because his ideas were too big, too generous, too threatening to the men who controlled the money and the power. They could not afford to have him succeed. The world he was trying to build would have made them obsolete. Free energy, available to everyone, generated by a tower and transmitted through the air like light from the sun. This would have collapsed the entire structure of industrial capitalism that depended on scarcity, on metering, on the control of essential resources. Tesla was trying to give away the most valuable thing in human civilization, energy itself. And in trying to give it away, he had made himself an enemy of every force that had profited from keeping energy expensive and controlled. The tower waited. The laboratory on Long Island waited. The dream waited. And Tesla, the man who had promised to light up the world, found himself increasingly in the dark, not because the electricity had failed, but because the belief that had sustained him, the belief that the world wanted what he was trying to give it, had been extinguished by the simple machinery of commerce and power. In the space between achievement and collapse, there exists a peculiar form of suffering that is visited upon those rare minds whose vision exceeds the capacity of their world to contain it. These are the men and women who see not what is, but what might be, who can perceive the invisible architecture of possibility that underlies the visible world. They are cursed with the ability to see clearly, to understand with perfect precision the shape of the future before it arrives, to know with an almost prophetic certainty which paths will lead to triumph and which to ruin. This gift, which appears to be the greatest blessing a human mind can possess, becomes in the living of it a profound and almost unbearable sorrow. For to see what others cannot see is to live always in a kind of loneliness, to know that one's certainty, no matter how clearly expressed, no matter how carefully explained, will meet with doubt and incomprehension in those around you. The mind that reaches too far beyond its time becomes isolated not by choice, but by necessity, separated from its contemporaries by the very clarity of its vision. Tesla understood this isolation with an acuteness that few have ever experienced. He had touched the edge of something vast, something that would eventually transform human civilization, the wireless transmission of power and information across great distances. He had seen this future so clearly that it was more real to him than the present moment, more tangible than the ground beneath his feet or the air that filled his lungs. Yet the very clarity of this vision, the very certainty with which he perceived it, made him unable to explain it adequately to those whose belief he needed. He could not compromise, could not simplify his conception to meet the expectations of minds less powerful than his own, and so he was left standing in the gap between what he knew and what others could believe, between the glorious future he could perceive and the harsh present in which he was forced to live. The tower at Wardenclyffe becomes, in this understanding, something more than an architectural structure or a failed technological experiment. It becomes a symbol of the profound tragedy that can befall the visionary mind, the tragedy not of failure itself, but of the isolation that failure in service of a transcendent vision creates. It reaches toward the sky not with the hope of success, but with the dignity of ambition itself, with the knowledge that some dreams are too large to be contained within a single lifetime, that some visions exceed the capacity of any present moment to accommodate them. The greatest minds often suffer the most, not because they are weaker than ordinary minds, but because they are stronger, because they can perceive more, understand more, dream more grandly than those around them. They are like travellers who have journeyed to a distant mountain peak and seen from that height the vast landscape that stretches beyond the horizon, and they cannot convince those in the valley below that such a landscape exists. They stand at the summit alone, knowledge burning in them like a light that has no one to illuminate, visions searing through them like electricity with no ground to flow toward. In the silence that follows the collapse of great dreams, in the moment when ambition faces the hard constraints of a world not yet ready to receive it, there is a kind of darkness that is almost holy, almost sacred, for it is the dark soil from which all genuine human progress eventually grows. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel on Fifth Avenue was where Nikola Tesla spent some of the most paradoxical years of his life, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and prestige, while his finances slowly evaporated like morning mist under an indifferent sun. It was here, in suites that cost more per month than most Americans earned in a year, that the great inventor began his slow descent into solitude and eccentricity. The hotel had become his refuge after the collapse of Wardenclyffe, that grand dream that had consumed not only his money but his reputation, his confidence, and his place in the world of practical science. The newspapers had moved on to other marvels, other inventors, other stories of progress and innovation, leaving Tesla to inhabit the margins of public consciousness like a ghost from an earlier age. He was still alive, still thinking, still inventing, but the world had largely forgotten how to listen. The Waldorf's mahogany-panelled halls and ornate elevators represented a world of refinement and order that Tesla desperately needed, a structured environment where he could maintain the illusion of a man still in control of his circumstances, even as control slipped through his fingers like water through cupped hands. He took his meals in the dining room at precise times, ordered by routine and ritual, and he began to develop certain peculiarities that his fellow guests noticed, with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The obsession with the number 3 emerged with the force of a compulsion. Tesla could not simply walk around the block. He had to do it 3 times. He could not accept a room without calculating its dimensions, ensuring they harmonized with his numerological preferences. At dinner, he required exactly 18 napkins, 6 sets of 3, and he would become deeply agitated if this precise number was not provided. These behaviours were not the affectations of a man performing eccentricity for effect. They were the genuine expressions of a mind that was attempting to impose order on a universe that had proven itself fundamentally chaotic and indifferent to genius. The Waldorf Astoria became the vessel that held him as the 20th century surged forward without him. Tesla had taken residence in this palace of marble and mahogany in the early years of the new century, moving through its corridors like a ghost learning to inhabit the living world. His room was modest, despite the grandeur that surrounded it. He required little, wanted less, and the hotel had come to understand this peculiarity as part of the building's permanent architecture, like the weight-bearing walls or the electrical systems that had been installed with such revolutionary vigour decades before. The mornings began before dawn, when the city still belonged to the street sweepers and the insomniacs, when Manhattan wore its most vulnerable face. He would dress with meticulous care, the ritual of buttoning his waistcoat and tying his cravat, a meditation that grounded him to the present moment, to the fact of his body still moving through time. The streets below were his cathedral, and he walked them with the devotion of a pilgrim returning to a shrine. Down Park Avenue he would go, his cane tapping against the pavement in a rhythm that seemed to match some internal metronome only he could hear, past the brownstones and the fire hydrants, past the women with their shopping baskets and the delivery boys on bicycles. The doormen of the Waldorf knew him as intimately as family, better perhaps because there was no resentment in their knowledge, only an accepting recognition of his strangeness, the way one accepts that certain rooms will always be cold or certain windows always stick. Thomas, the morning doorman with the silver hair and the precise military bearing, would nod with something approaching reverence, for Tesla had tipped generously in the early years and had earned the loyalty that such consideration purchased. The seasons circled around him as he circled around the park, and he witnessed them as a monk witnesses the turning of the liturgical year. In spring, when the trees along Fifth Avenue unclenched their buds, and the whole city seemed to overflow with a tentative green, he would pause at certain corners as if allowing himself to absorb this small proof that renewal was still possible. Summer turned Manhattan into an oven, the heat rising from the pavement in visible waves, and Tesla would adjust his walk to the shadier routes, moving through the canyons of buildings where the sun could not reach. By autumn, the leaves fell with such abundance that the sidewalks became a carpet of copper and gold, and he would step through them with an almost childlike appreciation, as if each leaf were a small miracle of colour. Winter was the hardest season, when the cold seemed to penetrate not just his clothing but his very thoughts, turning them slow and crystalline. He had always preferred the cool. Heat had never suited his nervous system, and he had written extensively about the way cold clarified the mind while heat muddled it. But now, in his 70s and 80s, the cold seemed a personal affront, a reminder that his body was becoming alien territory. He would retreat more often to his room, to the familiar walls and the books that had accumulated around him like friends. The other residents of the Waldorf barely glimpsed him. A widow on the 3rd floor had once remarked to her companion that she had seen that thin gentleman with the strange eyes in the elevator, and something in his gaze had unsettled her. She could not quite say why. He seemed to be looking at something beyond the brass fixtures and the mirrored walls, something visible only to himself. The hotel, which had once represented the pinnacle of modern achievement and luxury, had gradually become a container for his obsolescence. The lobby that thundered with the footsteps of important men no longer thrilled him. It merely reminded him of his irrelevance. The grand staircase that he sometimes descended felt like a journey backward in time, each step carrying him further from the future that had once been his to shape. The hotel was becoming a cage. He understood this with the clarity of someone watching his life from outside of it, and yet he could not leave. Where else would he go? The world had moved on, the 20th century racing ahead with technologies that built upon his work, but bore none of his name, and he remained here in this gilded tomb, waiting for a recognition that would come too late, or perhaps would never come at all. But beneath these numerical obsessions lay something far more profound, a profound loneliness that deepened with each passing year. Tesla had never married, had never cultivated close friendships in any conventional sense, and now, with his career in shambles and his fortune depleted, he found himself increasingly isolated from human connection. The hotels where he lived became not sanctuaries but prisons, beautiful cages in which a man of extraordinary intellect rattled against the bars of his own choosing. It was during these years that Tesla developed what would become one of the defining relationships of his final decades, his love affair with pigeons. This was not a casual interest or a mere hobby, but rather a profound emotional attachment that those who knew him regarded with a mixture of compassion and alarm. Tesla would spend hours in parks throughout New York City, particularly in the squares and green spaces where pigeons gathered, and he would feed them with an almost ceremonial devotion. He carried breadcrumbs and seeds in his pockets, and he would stand motionless, allowing the birds to land on his shoulders and arms, their small claws gripping the fabric of his jacket with a delicate insistence. For a man who had once been obsessed with the mechanics of flight itself, who had designed aerial vehicles and spent countless hours contemplating the aerodynamic principles that governed bird movement, this communion with living creatures represented something deeper than mere scientific observation. It was love, in its purest and most uncomplicated form. Among the thousands of pigeons that populated New York's parks, there was one that captured Tesla's heart completely. She was a white pigeon, pristine and ethereal, and Tesla became convinced that this particular bird possessed an intelligence and a sensitivity that set her apart from all others. He referred to her as his darling, and he spoke of her with the tenderness that another man might reserve for a beloved wife or child. To those who witnessed these conversations, it was heartbreaking and slightly unsettling. The image of one of the world's greatest minds pouring out his affections upon a common city pigeon. Yet to Tesla, this bird represented something that human beings had failed to provide: unconditional acceptance, the comfort of a presence that did not judge or dismiss, that did not understand his failures or mock his eccentricities. The pigeon simply existed in his presence, and that simple fact was enough to fill a void that no amount of scientific achievement or public acclaim could ever have filled. Washington Square Park was where his heart still beat, where the apparatus of emotion that had been carefully sealed away for so many decades would suddenly, mysteriously, open. The pigeons were democracy in feathered form, he sometimes thought, drawing no distinction between the rich person with a fine coat and the poor child with a pocket full of breadcrumbs. They descended impartially, a cloud of grey-blue wings, their red feet scratching against the concrete and the pavement. Tesla would arrive at the park in the afternoon, when the light had a particular quality of slanting warmth, when the shadows grew long and the day began its slow descent into evening. He would find his bench, the one he preferred near the fountain where the water caught the light and fractured it into 1,000 small rainbows, and he would settle there with the patience of someone who had learned that time is not a thing to be spent, but rather a thing to be inhabited. In his pockets, he carried breadcrumbs that he had carefully saved from his meagre hotel meals, and sometimes birdseed purchased from a vendor who knew him and set aside the finest quality, knowing he would pay whatever price was asked without negotiation. The pigeons soon learned his particular frequency, the specific timbre of his voice when he called to them, and they would gather round him like courtiers attending a king. There was the white one, of course, the one that had become the object of such devoted attention that it bordered on religious ceremony, but there were also the others, the iridescent green and purple one with the slightly torn wing, the grey one with one eye, the fat one with the mud-coloured plumage that seemed always on the verge of explosion. He knew them individually, had given them names in the privacy of his own mind, and he understood their personalities with an acuity that bordered on the supernatural. When the white pigeon did not arrive for several days in the spring of 1937, he experienced a grief so acute that it physically prevented him from eating, and he remained in his room in a state of semi-consciousness, certain that the bird had died and that a part of his own soul had died with it. The other residents of the hotel whispered about him, and the staff maintained a discreet concern that stopped short of intervention. When the white pigeon eventually returned, slightly bedraggled but unmistakably the same individual, Tesla experienced something that he might have called joy if he had permitted himself the indulgence of such an emotion. The park itself was a theatre of human life that he observed from his bench with the detachment of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Mothers pushed their children in perambulators, young lovers walked hand in hand under the arch, Old men played chess at the stone tables, and the city's entire human pageant unfolded before him. People noticed him occasionally. The strange old man with the electric eyes who seemed to be having conversations with the pigeons, who would sit perfectly still for hours with his hands folded precisely in his lap. Some saw in him a madman. Others sensed something more complex, a consciousness that had withdrawn from the ordinary world and found its habitation in something purer. A woman who passed the park regularly on her walk home from work found herself drawn to observe him, and she came to understand, without being able to articulate it, that he was engaged in a form of prayer. The light played constantly across the water of the fountain, and Tesla would watch these light shows with the intensity that other men might reserve for the paintings in a museum. The way the late afternoon sun struck the spray created ephemeral sculptures of liquid crystal, momentary architectures that existed for only seconds before dissolving back into chaos and then reforming in new configurations. This was mathematics and art combined, he understood. This was the visible manifestation of the principles that governed all of creation. The pigeons' wings caught this light as they wheeled and dived, creating brief flashes of iridescence, and he would track these movements with his eyes in a kind of meditation that brought him closer to peace than anything else in his remaining years. This ritual had become not merely the emotional center of his life, but its entire purpose, the reason he continued to draw breath and move through the world. Everything else, the work that had once consumed him, the accolades he had never fully received, the sense of mission that had once propelled him forward, all of this had been stripped away until only this remained. An old man on a bench, feeding pigeons in a park, finding in their simple companionship a love that the human world had never been equipped to give him. Throughout these forgotten years, Tesla continued to invent. His mind did not stop simply because the world had lost interest in his work. He designed a bladeless turbine, a device that he believed would revolutionize energy production by using smooth rotating disks instead of traditional blades, operating on principles that would not be fully appreciated or explored until decades after his death. He conceived of vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, VTOL designs, that anticipated by half a century the actual development of such vehicles. He developed theories regarding radar principles and the reflection of electromagnetic waves, insights that would ultimately prove instrumental to the development of radar technology during the Second World War, though Tesla received neither recognition nor compensation for these contributions. Each patent that issued from his mind was a small act of defiance against the world that had rejected him, a way of asserting his continued relevance even as circumstances conspired to render him obsolete. Yet these patents were mere abstractions without the means to develop them, without factories or funding or the kind of public backing that an invention required in order to become a tangible product in the world. They existed on paper and in Tesla's mind, brilliant concepts that might as well have been dreams for all the practical impact they had on his life, or on the world around him. The year 1915 brought with it a rumour that briefly ignited hope in Tesla's heart. Word circulated through the scientific community that both Tesla and Thomas Edison were being considered for the Nobel Prize in Physics. After all the years of conflict, all the battles fought in laboratories and courtrooms and newspapers, the two great rivals might finally be honoured together by the Swedish Academy. But the rumour proved to be false, or perhaps it was true that they were considered and were ultimately rejected. The historical record is murky on this point, and what actually happened exists somewhere between fact and legend, much like so much of Tesla's life. What is certain is that neither man received the prize that year, and the opportunity for reconciliation or mutual recognition passed into history unrealized. Some have suggested that the Nobel Committee was unwilling to honor Edison because of his role in spreading fear about alternating current, or that they were reluctant to give Tesla the prize given his increasingly questionable mental state and the failure of his most ambitious projects. Whatever the reason, the effect on Tesla was devastating. Here was evidence yet again that the world did not understand his contributions, that his genius was unappreciated even by those institutions that were supposed to recognize and celebrate scientific achievement. As Tesla's financial situation deteriorated, the Waldorf Astoria eventually became impossible to maintain. The hotel manager was patient, at least for a time, but even patience has its limits when bills remain unpaid month after month. Tesla was forced to move, first to other, less expensive hotels in Manhattan, establishments that were respectable but not prestigious, establishments that served as way stations on the long journey toward absolute destitution. His room grew smaller, his surroundings less grand, but his habits and obsessions remained constant. He continued his precise routines, his numerological calculations, his careful management of every detail that he could control in an environment that was otherwise spiraling beyond his control. He continued to feed the pigeons, spending what little money he had on breadcrumbs and seeds, sacrificing his own comfort to provide sustenance for the birds that had become his only reliable companions. Westinghouse was still alive during these years, still building his industrial empire, still profiting from the AC system that Tesla had designed and perfected. But there was a debt between them, a moral dimension to their relationship that transcended the legal contracts and business arrangements that bound them together. Tesla had made a choice in his younger years, a decision that had seemed necessary at the time. When Westinghouse was facing financial ruin in the early 1890s, when the Panic of 1893 threatened to destroy his company and leave him bankrupt, Tesla had torn up his royalty contract. He had released Westinghouse from the obligation to pay him a percentage of every AC motor sold, a percentage that by some estimates could have amounted to $12 million per year by the early years of the 20th century. Instead, Tesla had accepted a settlement, a mere pittance by comparison, and Westinghouse had been saved. The company survived, grew stronger, and eventually became one of the most powerful industrial corporations in America. Westinghouse lived out his days in comfort and respect, dying in 1914 with a vast fortune and an unblemished reputation as an industrial visionary. And Tesla lived out his days moving between increasingly shabby hotel rooms, feeding pigeons breadcrumbs, and wondering if he had made the right choice. The mathematics of it were devastating. $12 million per year meant that over the course of the decades that followed, Tesla had essentially given away hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money, a fortune that could have secured his comfort for the rest of his life, that could have funded his own research and development, that could have allowed him to build Wardenclyffe to completion and beyond. But he had made the choice to save his friend, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate as a man of poverty and obscurity. Think about that for a moment. The man who invented the system that powers every home, every hospital, every city on Earth, the man whose alternating current flows through the wires above your head right now as you listen to this, was feeding pigeons in a park because he had given away his fortune to save a friend's company. Every time you turn on a light, every time you plug in a device, every time electricity flows through your walls and powers the countless machines that sustain modern civilization, you are using the fruits of Tesla's genius. And yet he died in a borrowed room with no family to mourn him, no fortune to leave behind, no legacy of wealth or comfort or security. He had given everything to the world, had offered his greatest discoveries to humanity with an open hand, and humanity had repaid him with indifference and forgetfulness. If you're still awake, you're doing great. Subscribe to the Calm Archive if you haven't already. A new sleep story arrives every single day. Now, let's stay with Tesla through these quiet, lonely years. By the 1930s, Tesla was living in the Hotel New Yorker, a relatively modest establishment compared to the Waldorf Astoria of his earlier years. His room was number 3327, the digits adding up to 15, which reduced to 6, which was divisible by 3, a numerical harmony that brought him comfort even as his physical circumstances deteriorated further. The room was sparsely furnished, the kind of space that a man with almost no money occupies out of necessity rather than choice. But it was his, and it was structured by his will, organized according to his precise requirements and specifications. His daily routine had become almost ritualistic in its precision. He would wake at dawn and spend hours thinking, sometimes writing down his ideas, sometimes simply letting his mind wander through the vast landscape of problems and principles that occupied his consciousness. He would leave the hotel and walk through the streets of Manhattan, often heading toward Bryant Park, where he would spend hours feeding his beloved white pigeon and the thousands of other birds that congregated there. The pigeons recognized him, or so he believed, and they would gather around him with an eagerness that suggested they understood him, that they appreciated his presence in a way that human beings no longer did. After his time with the pigeons, he would sometimes visit a nearby cathedral, finding in the quiet spaces of the church a kind of peace that eluded him in the crowded streets and busy rooms of the city. He would sit in the pews, not necessarily to pray in any traditional religious sense, but simply to exist in a space that was quiet and ancient and removed from the frenetic energy of the modern world. His appearance had changed dramatically over the years. He had grown thin and somewhat frail, his suit hanging loosely on his diminished frame, his hair grown long and white, his face marked by age and by the accumulation of disappointment and solitude. Those who encountered him in the streets of Manhattan saw an eccentric old man, perhaps a vagrant, certainly someone who existed on the margins of society. They did not see one of the greatest scientific minds of the age. They did not recognize the man who had fundamentally altered the course of human civilization. He was simply another lonely figure moving through the city, feeding birds, walking to church, living a life that seemed incomprehensible to those who observed it from the outside. Now the fever dreams began. It was 1937 when Tesla made his first public announcement about what he called the death beam, the teleforce, a weapon that he claimed could project destructive energy across vast distances and render all traditional military installations obsolete. He was 81 years old, living in the Hotel New Yorker in room 3327, and he called a press conference to announce this extraordinary discovery to the world. The journalists who attended were uncertain what to make of him. Was he serious? Or was this the rambling of an elderly man whose mind had finally broken under the weight of decades of disappointment and isolation? Tesla spoke with absolute conviction, with the authority of a man who had spent his entire life validating his claims through practical demonstrations and patents and scientific achievement. He described the principles underlying the weapon with technical precision, explaining how concentrated beams of energy could be transmitted through the Earth or the atmosphere to strike targets with devastating force. He claimed that with such a weapon in place, war would become impossible, that no nation would dare to attack another for fear of instant annihilation. It was peace through ultimate deterrence, a vision that had a certain logic to it even if the technical details seemed fantastic and improbable. The press conference was called for the afternoon of the 15th of July in the year 1937 at the Hotel New Yorker, where Tesla had maintained residence for several years now, the Waldorf having become too expensive even for his modest requirements. The journalists arrived with their notebooks and their cameras, skeptical but curious, the smell of cigarette smoke and the electricity of anticipation filling the small room where he would present his latest claims. Tesla himself was 81 years old, and the weight of those years sat upon him visibly. His clothes hung from his frame like fabric on a scarecrow. His hands trembled slightly as he stood before them, but his eyes retained an unsettling intensity, a brightness that seemed almost feverish. He had prepared carefully for this moment, had rehearsed the words and the gestures, and he carried with him sketches and notes that he believed would prove the feasibility of what he was about to propose. The death beam, he called it, though he preferred the more technical designation of a particle projection ray, a device that could harness the power of electricity and direct it across any distance with devastating accuracy. He spoke of it with the kind of absolute conviction that had characterized his descriptions of wireless power transmission decades earlier. And this very fact gave the journalists pause, for they all knew that wireless power transmission had failed to materialize, that Tesla had been chasing that ghost for more than a generation, and yet here he was again, an old man who had already once been proven wrong, asking them to believe in another impossible thing. The room itself was ordinary, a hotel conference space with a long wooden table and uncomfortable chairs, nothing that would suggest it was the venue for a revelation that could alter the course of human civilization. The light from the windows was the pale, flat light of summer in New York, and it struck Tesla's face in a way that emphasized both his intelligence and his remoteness from the world he was trying to convince. The journalists leaned forward slightly, their skepticism warring with the possibility that they might be in the presence of genius, and this internal conflict played visibly across their faces. One of them, a woman named Lucy Moore from the Herald Tribune, found herself moved by something she could not quite name, the way he spoke about his creation with such tenderness, as if it were a beloved child rather than a weapon. There was pity in the room too, palpable and uncomfortable, the sense that they were witnessing not the unveiling of a miraculous invention, but the final desperate grasp of a man whose moment had passed. The geopolitical context hung over the proceedings like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Europe was tightening like a fist. The Spanish Civil War had recently ended, and across Europe fascism was spreading like a fever. Japan had invaded Manchuria. Germany was rearming in defiance of the Versailles Treaty. The world was gearing itself inexorably toward war. In this context, Tesla's claims about a death beam took on an entirely different resonance. They became simultaneously more relevant and more fantastical. If such a device could exist, it would be the ultimate weapon, the instrument that could render all conventional warfare obsolete and tip the balance of power irrevocably toward whoever possessed it. The journalists could not help but calculate the implications, the way their minds involuntarily sketched out scenarios of global domination and mutual destruction. Tesla himself seemed aware of this subtext, and he leaned into it slightly, suggesting that his invention could, if properly developed, render all warfare impossible because it would make any aggressive nation instantly vulnerable to complete annihilation. There was a logic to this that had a certain appeal, the threat of total destruction as a pathway to peace. But it was a logic that belonged to a man still thinking in 19th century frameworks, still believing in the power of reason and mutual interest to govern the conduct of nations. The journalists asked their questions with a mixture of respect and skepticism, and Tesla answered with the precision of someone explaining a mathematical theorem to a student of below-average ability. He showed them his drawings, the careful sketches that demonstrated the basic principles, though he admitted that the full specifications were locked in his mind and would be revealed only to a nation that agreed to implement the device for the peaceful purposes he intended. There was something almost pathetic about this claim, the notion that he alone possessed the secret that could save or destroy the world, and that he would release it only under conditions that no nation would ever agree to meet. As the press conference drew to a close, the journalists filed out with their notebooks full of quotes that they knew would be dismissed as the ravings of a brilliant mind that had finally succumbed to obsession and delusion. The newspapers would run stories with headlines that mixed wonder and pity in equal measure, and the public would read them with the same mixture, and Tesla would be remembered once more as the man who had once done impossible things and had then spent the rest of his life claiming he was about to do even more impossible things. He stood alone in the conference room after they had left, surrounded by his drawings and his notes, and he felt the weight of his own irrelevance descend upon him like a physical force. His birthday press conferences became legendary, at least in retrospect. Every year on July 10th, Tesla would summon the press to his hotel room and make increasingly wild and fantastical claims about his work and his discoveries. He would announce new inventions, new principles, new ways of understanding the physical universe. The journalists who attended these events were often sympathetic to him, aware of his historical significance even if they were skeptical of his current claims. Some of them recognized him as a figure of genuine tragic grandeur, a man whose fall from prominence was all the more poignant because of how high he had once been elevated. These press conferences were his way of maintaining connection to the world, of insisting that he still mattered, that his ideas still held significance even if no one had the vision or the resources to bring them to concrete realization. During these final years, Tesla's obsession with his white pigeon only deepened. This was not simply a sentimental attachment to a favorite bird, but rather something that approached the intensity of a religious devotion. Tesla lavished care and attention on the pigeon, spending what little money he had to ensure that she had the finest foods and the most comfortable accommodations possible. He spoke to her as though she were a person, confiding in her, sharing his thoughts and his hopes and his frustrations with a level of emotional openness that he extended to almost no human being. When she died, the loss was devastating. Tesla said that a light had gone out of his life, and something fundamental seemed to have died within him when the pigeon passed away. It was as though the last thread tying him to the world of living things, the last relationship that gave his existence meaning, had been severed. Alone in room 3327, day after day, night after night, Tesla's mind continued to generate ideas and theories, even as his body grew weaker and more fragile. He kept notebooks filled with sketches and calculations, continued to patent ideas even though he had no means of developing them into actual devices. His room became a kind of shrine to his own consciousness, filled with the accumulated debris of a lifetime of thinking. Papers, notebooks, technical drawings, books, all arranged according to the logic of his own mind. On January 7th, 1943, a maid entered room 3327 to clean and discovered that Nikola Tesla was dead. He lay on the bed, aged 86 years old, having died alone, with no one to hold his hand or comfort him in his final moments. The hotel authorities were notified. The death was officially recorded, and arrangements were made for what should have been a straightforward and respectful handling of the deceased's remains and possessions. But this is where the story takes a strange and troubling turn, where documented history begins to shade into speculation and mystery. The winter of 1943 had come to New York with unusual severity, the temperatures dropping well below what was typical, and the city had begun its slow transformation into a garrison state. The war was no longer something happening overseas in abstractions. It had become woven into the very fabric of daily existence. At night, the city was subjected to periodic blackouts, practice runs for the air raids that intelligence suggested might come but had never materialized, and during these blackouts the entire metropolitan area would go dark, an irony that was not lost on anyone who knew the history of electricity and its greatest pioneer. Tesla, now 86 years old and more ghost than man, experienced these blackouts as a kind of return to an earlier world, a world without light that he had spent his entire life trying to illuminate. He remained in his room at the Hotel New Yorker, where he had been living for several years in circumstances that had grown progressively more straitened as his resources dwindled, and his mind became increasingly difficult to accommodate. The room was small and austere, populated by stacks of newspapers and journals and scientific papers that he read obsessively, as if the sum total of human knowledge printed on paper might somehow unlock the mysteries that had eluded him in practice. His health had been declining for months, his heart was not strong, and he had never truly recovered from the minor stroke that had affected him in the previous year. He ate little, perhaps subsisting on the bare minimum required to keep his body functioning, and he slept at odd hours, his circadian rhythms having come completely untethered from the regular patterns of day and night. The hotel staff treated him with a kind of wary solicitude, checking on him occasionally but maintaining a respectful distance, as if they sensed that he inhabited a territory that was not quite part of the ordinary hotel anymore. The maid, a woman named Margot Svedberg, who had been with the hotel for many years and had attended to Tesla's room countless times, noticed that he had been particularly withdrawn in recent weeks. He had stopped taking his meals in the dining room, subsisting instead on the occasional meal left outside his door, which he often didn't eat. His correspondence had dwindled to almost nothing. The few letters that occasionally arrived were usually bills or notices that he set aside with a gesture of dismissal. On the morning of the 7th of January, Margot knocked on his door at her usual time and received no response. She knocked again, called out his name, and when there was still no answer, she used her master key to enter the room. The light from the hallway spilled into the darkened space, and she found him there on the bed, still in his clothes, his thin frame almost invisible beneath the blanket. For a moment she thought he might simply be sleeping. But something in the quality of his stillness, the absolute absence of the subtle movements that accompany breath and life, told her that the moment had come and gone. She did not scream or cry out. Instead, she simply stood in the doorway for a long moment, aware that she had just witnessed the departure of the last inhabitant of a world that was already receding rapidly into the past. The newspapers that were eventually notified of his death treated it with considerably less fanfare than might have been accorded to a man who had been, in his time, one of the most celebrated figures in the world. The obituaries were respectful but brief, and many of them emphasized the decline and the eccentricity more than the achievement and the brilliance. The city that he had helped to build and illuminate mourned him in the abstract, the way a place mourns an old building that has been deemed unsafe and demolished, with a mixture of regret and relief that the space can now be used for something new. The blackouts continued through the winter nights as the war raged on across the Atlantic, and the city that Tesla had spent his life trying to make luminous remained periodically dark in accordance with protocols designed to protect it from an enemy that might not even come. In his room at the Hotel New Yorker, after the body had been removed and the effects catalogued for disposition, there remained only the paper artifacts of a life spent chasing down the mathematics of the universe. Notebooks filled with equations and sketches, letters from people long dead, all the evidence of a mind that had never stopped burning even as the world moved on without it. The FBI came to the Hotel New Yorker and took possession of Tesla's papers. This much is certain and documented. The official justification was national security. Tesla's work on electromagnetic weapons and other military technologies meant that his papers could not be allowed to fall into the hands of foreign powers during wartime. The FBI feared that agents of Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan might attempt to access Tesla's files and use his theoretical work to develop weapon systems that could turn the tide of the war. Yet questions persist about what exactly was taken, what was examined, and what ultimately happened to the documents that were seized from Tesla's room. Some of Tesla's papers eventually reappeared in the archives of various institutions. His designs and inventions and theoretical work were recovered and studied and became part of the historical record. But other documents have never been found, other notebooks have disappeared without a trace, and it remains an open question whether these missing papers contained plans for genuinely revolutionary technologies, the rambling of a man whose mind had begun to deteriorate, or something in between, theories that were brilliant but impractical, ideas that were ahead of their time and might eventually be developed by future generations of scientists and engineers. And even now, decades after his death, there are questions that have never been answered about what was in those papers the FBI seized from his hotel room. Tesla claimed he had designed a weapon that could end all war. He claimed he could transmit energy to any point on the globe without wires. Were these the ravings of a broken mind or the blueprints of a future we haven't built yet? The mystery remains, and will perhaps remain forever, a final testament to the extraordinary and unknowable dimensions of Tesla's genius and his suffering. What we do know is that Tesla left behind approximately 300 patents, inventions that spanned the entire range of electrical and mechanical engineering, from the AC motor to the transformer to wireless transmission systems to aerial devices that anticipated modern aircraft design. These patents represent some of the most important technical innovations of the modern era. His legacy is written into the very infrastructure of civilization, into every electrical system, every power grid, every wireless device that connects us to one another across the distances that separate us. We live in Tesla's world. We use his inventions every single day. And yet for much of the 20th century his name was nearly forgotten, his contributions unacknowledged, his life a mystery even to those who benefited most directly from his genius. In the vast architecture of human progress, certain names echo through the ages not because of the wealth they accumulated or the empires they built, but because of the fundamental truths they revealed about the nature of the universe. Nikola Tesla belongs to this rarest category of human achievement, a mind that did not merely improve upon existing systems but imagined entirely new ones, a consciousness that operated on a frequency so far beyond the conventions of his time that the world could not accommodate his vision. And yet, for decades after his death, his name was largely absent from the textbooks, from the public consciousness, from the collective memory of a civilization that owed its electrical infrastructure almost entirely to his genius. Edison remained famous, Marconi remained famous. The names of industrialists and financiers and politicians filled the history books. But Tesla, the man who had actually designed the system that powered it all, faded into a kind of scholarly obscurity, known to engineers and physicists but invisible to the broader public. It is one of the great ironies of technological history that the man whose inventions touch every human life on Earth every single day was, for much of the 20th century, virtually unknown to the people whose lives he had transformed. The rehabilitation of Tesla's reputation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the decades following his death. Scientists and engineers who understood the significance of his work began to advocate for recognition. In 1960, the General Conference on Weights and Measures officially named the unit of magnetic flux density the Tesla, a quiet but profound acknowledgement that placed his name alongside Newton, Ampere, Watt, and the other giants whose contributions had become part of the fundamental language of science. The Tesla as a unit of measurement means that every time a physicist or engineer discusses magnetic fields, every time a medical professional operates an MRI machine, every time a researcher calibrates an instrument that measures electromagnetic phenomena, the name Tesla is invoked as naturally as breathing. His name has become woven into the fabric of scientific discourse itself, a permanent fixture in the vocabulary of human knowledge. In Belgrade, the city that claimed him as one of its own, the Nikola Tesla Museum stands as a monument to his life and work. The museum houses many of his personal effects, his notebooks, his correspondence, and a collection of his inventions and models that testify to the extraordinary range and depth of his creative output. Visitors can see the actual devices that Tesla built, the coils and transformers and generators that he designed with his own hands, and they can begin to appreciate the sheer volume of innovation that flowed from a single human mind over the course of a lifetime. The museum also holds Tesla's ashes, contained in a golden sphere, a fitting receptacle for a man who had spent his life contemplating the geometry of energy and the perfection of natural forms. The sphere sits in a place of honour, visited by thousands of people each year who come to pay their respects to a man they recognise as one of the true architects of the modern world. At Niagara Falls, where Tesla's alternating current system first demonstrated its world-changing potential, a statue of the inventor stands overlooking the thundering water. The statue depicts Tesla reading from a notebook, absorbed in thought, and it faces the falls themselves as if contemplating the vast energy that he was the first to successfully harness and transmit over distance. There is something deeply poignant about this statue, standing in the mist and spray of the falls, a bronze figure frozen in the act of thinking while the water roars endlessly beside him. The falls continue to generate electricity, continue to send power across the landscape, continue to fulfill the promise that Tesla made more than a century ago. The water falls, the turbines turn, the current flows, and the statue stands, silent and contemplative, a permanent witness to the marriage of natural power and human ingenuity. Perhaps the most visible testament to Tesla's enduring influence came in 2003, when Elon Musk and his co-founders chose the name Tesla Motors for their electric vehicle company. The choice was deliberate, a conscious invocation of the inventor's legacy, an acknowledgement that the electric future that Musk was trying to build had its roots in Tesla's alternating current system and his broader vision of a world powered by clean, efficient electrical energy. The company's success has brought Tesla's name to millions of people who might never have encountered it otherwise, emblazoning it on cars that move silently through the streets of cities around the world, powered by the same fundamental principles that Tesla articulated more than a century ago. Whether this commercial use of his name would have pleased or troubled the inventor, a man who cared more about ideas than about money, who gave away his fortune to save a friend's company, who died in poverty rather than compromise his vision, is a question that each person must answer for themselves. The resurrection of Nikola Tesla came not through the efforts of historians or engineers, but through the democratic machinery of the internet itself, that vast network of connected minds that would have fascinated him had he lived to see it, for it was, in a sense, the embodiment of one of his grandest visions, wireless communication linking the entire world. In the decades immediately following his death, Tesla remained largely forgotten by the culture at large, remembered primarily by engineers and scientists who understood the extent to which modern technology had been built upon the foundation of his work. But beginning in the 1990s and accelerating into the new century, something changed. Bloggers and enthusiasts began to rediscover Tesla through digitized papers and early internet forums, and they found in him not merely a historical figure, but a kind of secular saint, a visionary whose ideas had been systematically suppressed or forgotten by a world too bound up in the logic of capital and corporate power to properly appreciate him. The Oatmeal, a webcomic creator named Matthew Inman, would become the unlikely prophet of Tesla's second coming, when, in 2012, he launched a crowdfunding campaign to purchase the land where Wardenclyffe Tower had once stood, the great laboratory where Tesla had conducted some of his most audacious experiments, and where he had attempted to transmit electrical power without wires across the distance of the Atlantic. The campaign raised more than $1 million, an enormous sum of money mobilized by thousands of small donors, each contributing what they could, driven by a sense that this place was sacred ground that should be preserved as a monument to what human genius could conceive of and nearly accomplish. This campaign was, in a very real sense, a direct response to the way that Tesla had been treated in life, a crowdfunding model, a democratic assertion that the man and his legacy mattered, that his vision deserved to be honoured not by great institutions or government agencies, but by the collective will of individuals who had discovered him through the internet and recognised in him a kindred spirit. For the internet had made Tesla into a folk hero and a symbol of the visionary underdog, the person whose work changed the world, but who died poor and forgotten because the world was not yet ready to understand what he had to offer. There was something about his story that spoke to the era of disruption and innovation, the entrepreneurial mythology that surrounded figures like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. Though in truth, Tesla preceded them all, and his life offered a cautionary tale about what happened to the visionary in a world that valued only that which could be immediately monetized. Online forums filled with Tesla enthusiasts debated his theories, shared digitized papers and early videos of his work, speculated endlessly about what he might have accomplished had he lived longer and received better support. YouTube became a repository for Tesla documentaries and educational videos, each one attempting to explain the principles behind his inventions and to restore to him some of the cultural prominence that had been denied him in life. The documentary The Current War, released in 2017, brought his historical drama to a new generation, even as it simplified and dramatized the actual historical record in ways that would have amused or appalled him. But perhaps most importantly, the internet had democratized access to Tesla's own words, his own writings and letters, which could now be read by anyone with a connection to a computer, in an era when such connections had become nearly universal in the developed world. This meant that people could discover directly, without the mediation of textbooks or official histories, what Tesla had actually thought and written, and they could come to their own conclusions about the significance of his life and work. The mythology that had grown up around Tesla in the internet age was, in many ways, more useful than the historical reality could ever be, because it suggested that the world is not fixed, that great ideas do eventually triumph, that the suppressed visionary is eventually recognized and restored to honor. In this sense, Tesla's life in death had become an allegory for the power of persistence and the eventual vindication of truth, and this narrative was far more comforting than the actual story of a man who had died impoverished and largely forgotten, whose greatest inventions had been stolen or circumvented, and who had lived to see a world that had forgotten him even before his death. Yet there was something genuinely moving in this resurrection, this second chance at significance that the digital age had granted to a man who had seemed permanently consigned to obscurity. In the end, Tesla had been vindicated not by the official channels of power and recognition, but by the grassroots enthusiasm of millions of people scattered across the globe, connected by invisible waves of electromagnetic radiation, the very thing that Tesla had first imagined and made real. The justice was poetic, if perhaps only poetic, a kind of temporal symmetry that suggested that in the long arc of history, truth and genius do eventually find their way to recognition, even if the person who possessed them does not live to see it. And here, in the quiet darkness of this hour, as you settle deeper into the comfort of your bed and let the tensions of the day dissolve like morning frost in sunlight, consider the extraordinary paradox of Nikola Tesla's life. He was a man who wanted to give energy to the world for free, who believed that the resources of the earth belonged to all of humanity and should not be hoarded or metered or controlled by the few. He was defeated not by the limitations of his science, but by the limitations of the economic system in which he operated. A system that could not accommodate generosity on such a scale, that could not allow the most valuable commodity in civilization to be distributed without cost. The question of whether Tesla's vision of free wireless energy was technically feasible remains debated among scientists and engineers. Some believe that his ideas, properly developed, could have worked. Others argue that the physics simply does not support wireless power transmission on the scale he envisioned. But what is not debated is the purity of his intention, the sincerity of his belief that technology should serve all of humanity equally, and the tragic cost of holding such ideals in a world that operates on different principles. Think about the hum of electricity that surrounds you right now. It is there, always there, a constant presence in the background of modern life. The current that flows through the wires in your walls oscillates back and forth, alternating in direction, exactly as Tesla designed it to do. It cycles 60 times per second in America, 50 times per second in much of the rest of the world, a rhythmic pulse that is as constant and reliable as a heartbeat. This hum, this gentle oscillation, is Tesla's gift to you. Every light that illuminates your room, every device that charges beside your bed, every appliance that waits silently in your kitchen for the morning, all of them are connected to a system that began as a vision in a park in Budapest, on an evening in February 1882, when a young man saw the rotating magnetic field with the clarity of absolute revelation. The rotating magnetic field. Let that concept settle into your mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. A magnetic field that rotates, that turns continuously, creating motion from invisible force. It is the principle that drives every electric motor on Earth, every fan, every pump, every compressor, every conveyor belt, every elevator, every train. The motors that cool your home, that pump water to your faucet, that spin the hard drives in data centers across the world, all of them operate on the principle that Tesla perceived in that park, in that moment of illumination that changed everything. And there is something almost meditative about the rotation itself, about the endless turning of magnetic fields, about the ceaseless cycling of current from positive to negative and back again. It is a rhythm, a pulse, a kind of breathing. The universe breathes in alternating current. The electrons flow one way, then the other, then back again, in an endless dance that powers civilization. Let that rhythm become your rhythm now. Let the gentle oscillation of the current become the oscillation of your own breathing, in and out, positive and negative, wakefulness and sleep, each state flowing naturally into the other, each transition smooth and inevitable. If the calm archive has become part of your nighttime routine, that means the world to us. A new sleep story arrives every single night, so subscribe and let us guide you through history's most fascinating stories as you drift off to sleep. Now, as the story of Tesla draws toward its close, let the details begin to soften and blur, like a painting seen through rain-streaked glass. The specific dates and names and places are not important now. What matters is the feeling, the sense of a life lived with extraordinary purpose and extraordinary cost, of a mind that burned so brightly that it consumed itself, of a heart that loved the world so much that it gave everything away and asked for nothing in return. Tesla's pigeons are sleeping now, wherever pigeons sleep, their small bodies tucked against the cold, their eyes closed, their breathing slow and regular. The hotels where Tesla lived have been renovated or demolished, their rooms occupied by new guests who know nothing of the thin, haunted man who once paced these corridors at odd hours, counting his steps in multiples of 3. The towers he dreamed of building, those magnificent structures that would have transmitted energy across the globe, exist only in his notebooks and in the imaginations of those who still believe that his vision might someday be realized. The night deepens around you. The sounds of the world grow quieter, more distant, more abstract. You're safe here, in this warm darkness, in this comfortable space between wakefulness and sleep. The current hums in the walls. The magnetic fields rotate in their invisible dance. The world that Tesla built continues to function, continues to generate and transmit and transform energy, continues to light the darkness and warm the cold and connect the distant. You do not need to think about any of this. You do not need to understand the mathematics or the physics or the engineering. You simply need to rest, to breathe, to let go of the day and all its demands, and to allow yourself to drift into the deep, restorative sleep that your body and mind require. Breathe in slowly, deeply, feeling your chest expand and your body settle more heavily into the mattress. Hold that breath for just a moment. 1, 2, 3, and then release it, letting all the tension flow out of you like current through a wire, dissipating into the darkness, grounding itself in the earth beneath you. Again, breathe in. Feel the air fill your lungs, cool and clean and sustaining. Hold it and release. Each breath is a cycle, an alternation, a small echo of the great principle that Tesla discovered. The endless oscillation between states, the natural rhythm of a universe that moves in waves. The story is ending now, but the current continues. It flows through the wires of the world, through the transformers and generators and turbines that Tesla envisioned, through the vast invisible network of electromagnetic energy that blankets the Earth like a second atmosphere. Somewhere, right now, a turbine is turning at Niagara Falls, converting the energy of falling water into the electricity that powers a city. Somewhere, an engineer is calibrating an instrument measured in Teslas. Somewhere, a child is reading by electric light, absorbing knowledge that will shape the future in ways we cannot predict. And somewhere, in the quiet of the night, you're falling asleep, cradled by the hum of the alternating current that flows through your walls, surrounded by the invisible legacy of a man who dreamed of lighting up the world and who, despite everything, succeeded. Now, as you surrender fully to the darkness, let the current carry you. Let the hum of the world fade into silence. Let the rotating cycles of sleep draw you deeper and deeper into the restfulness that awaits. Sweet dreams, dear friends. Sleep well in the world that Tesla helped to build.